Wyoming Territory, 1890. The winter wind howled like a wounded animal across the vast emptiness, carrying ice crystals that bit at any exposed skin. Samuel Blackwood leaned forward in his saddle, squinting through the gathering darkness as he followed tracks nearly obscured by fresh falling snow. His breath clouded before him, dissipating into the fading light. The gray stallion beneath him snorted, pushing forward, despite the bitter cold. The horse thief was less than a mile ahead. Samuel could tell by the depth of the hoof prints and the occasional drops of blood in the snow, the animal had been ridden too hard, and its hooves cracking against the frozen ground. Just a little farther, Samuel murmured more to himself than to his mount. His weathered hand reached down to touch the worn wooden grip of his Colt revolver, a habit formed through years as a border patrolman. The metal star pinned to the inside of his coat pressed against his chest, a reminder of authority he rarely invoked anymore. 3 years since he'd worn it openly. 3 years since the fire. 3 years since he'd buried Rebecca and little Abigail in the rocky soil of Hope's Landing. The tracks veered suddenly toward a cluster of bare cottonwoods huddled against the base of a hill. Samuel's eyes narrowed, muscles tensing. He dismounted in one fluid motion, tying his horse to a scraggly pine before drawing his revolver. The cold metal felt familiar in his palm, an extension of his arm, as he moved silently through the deepening snow. A small fire flickered between the trees, barely visible through the swirling white. Samuel approached from downwind, careful to place each boot silently. He could make out a figure hunched over the meager flames, and beside them, the stolen horse, a chestnut mare from the Bridger Ranch, still saddled and steaming in the cold. "Don't move," Samuel's voice cut through the night. "Hands where I can see them." The figure jolted, then froze. Slowly, two small hands rose into the firelight. Samuel blinked, momentarily confused. These weren't the calloused hands of a seasoned horse thief. They were a child's hands, reddened by cold and trembling. "Stand up. Turn around," he commanded, though his voice had lost some of its edge. The figure obeyed, revealing not the hardened criminal Samuel had expected, but a boy no older than 12. His face was gaunt with hunger and exhaustion, dark eyes wide with fear. A worn woolen cap covered most of his hair, and his coat, several sizes too large, hung from thin shoulders like a tattered flag. "You're just a boy." Samuel lowered his gun slightly, but kept it ready. "Horse thieving's a hanging offense, son, even for children." The boy swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his skinny throat. "I know, sir, but I had to. Had to steal from honest folk." "Did you?" Samuel stepped closer, the fire casting deep shadows across his weathered face. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from Gettysburg, pulled taut as son frowned. "They're going to hang my mother when the sun rises," the boy blurted, voice cracking, "for a crime she didn't commit. I needed the horse to reach the next town, to find someone who could help us." Something in the child's desperate tone made Samuel pause. He'd heard too many lies in his years as a lawman to be easily fooled, but the raw fear in the boy's eyes struck a chord deep within him. "What's your name, boy?" Van Holden, sir." "And your mother's Clara Holden. She's a widow. My papa died at Vicksburg." The boy's chin lifted slightly at the mention of his father, a small gesture of pride amid his fear. Samuel holstered his weapon, slowly studying the child. Vicksburg, another battlefield where good men had died. Another widow left to fend for herself. "Where were you heading?" "Cheyenne," Van answered. "They have a proper judge there, not like—" He stopped abruptly, glancing down. "Not like who?" Samuel pressed. Van's hands clenched into small fists at his sides. "Judge Hayes. He came to town 3 months ago. Said Ma killed Mr. Peterson, the ranch foreman, and stole his cattle." The boy's voice trembled with barely contained rage. "But she didn't do it. She was with me that night. She's never hurt nobody. She was a nurse in the war." A chill that had nothing to do with the snow ran down Samuel's spine. "Did you say Hayes, Gideon Hayes?" Van nodded, surprise flickering across his face. "You know him?" Samuel turned away, his mind racing back to smoke-filled tents, to wounded men screaming, to a courtyard where innocent men stood before a firing squad on Hayes's orders. To the military tribunal where Samuel had testified against the colonel, only to watch the man walk free on technicalities and political connections. "I know him," Samuel finally answered, his voice distant. He glanced at the eastern horizon where the faintest lightning of the sky warned of approaching dawn. "Where's your mother now?" "Hope's Landing jail. They're going to hang her at sunrise." Van's voice broke. "Please, mister, I don't know what else to do." Samuel stood silent for a long moment, snow gathering in on his broad shoulders. Behind his eyes, memories flickered like dying flames. Rebecca's voice echoed across the years. "You can't save everyone, Sam, but that's never stopped you from trying." And Abigail, to his little girl, looking up at him with absolute trust, "Promise you won't let the bad men win anymore, Papa." The promises he'd made, the promises he'd failed to keep. Samuel sighed his breath, forming a cloud in the cold air. Put out that fire. We're heading back to Hope's Landing. Van's eyes widened. But they'll arrest me too, and they'll hang Ma. No, Samuel said, his voice hardening with resolve. They won't. He reached inside his coat and removed the tarnished silver star, holding it in his palm for a moment before pinning it to his chest for the first time in 3 years. Not while I have anything to say about it. The ride back to Hope's Landing was silent, save for the crunch of hooves on snow and the occasional howl of distant wolves. Samuel had returned the mare to the boy, riding alongside him on his own stallion. Twice he caught Van nodding off in the saddle, exhaustion finally claiming him despite his fear. As they crested the final ridge, Hope's Landing appeared below them, a cluster of wooden buildings huddled against the vast Wyoming wilderness, like a fistful of matchsticks dropped onto pristine white paper. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin gray ribbons, and lanterns glowed in windows despite the early hour. And there in the center of town stood a gallows freshly built and waiting. Van made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper. Samuel's jaw tightened. Stay close to me, he said quietly, and whatever happens, don't run. They rode down the main street as the eastern sky blushed pink with dawn. A few early risers paused to stare at the odd pair, the grim-faced man with the lawman's badge and the exhausted boy at his side. Whispers followed them like shadows. That's Clara Holden's boy. Thought he ran off. Who's that with him? Is that a badge? Samuel ignored them all, his eyes fixed on the jailhouse ahead. As they dismounted, the door swung open and a barrel-chested man with a week's worth of stubble stepped out, adjusting the sheriff's badge on his chest. Help you, stranger. The man's hand hovered near his holster. Samuel Blackwood, former Captain U.S. Border Patrol, Samuel replied evenly, noting how the sheriff's eyes widened slightly at the introduction. I'm here about Clara Holden. The sheriff's expression hardened. Ain't nothing to discuss. She's been tried and sentenced. Hangings in 2 hours. By Judge Gideon Hayes, I understand. Something flashed in the sheriff's eyes, uncertainty, perhaps even fear. That's right. He's presiding here temporarily while Judge Wheeler recovers from his fall. Convenient timing, Samuel remarked coldly. I need to see the prisoner. Now wait just a minute, the sheriff began, but Samuel cut him off. This isn't a request, Sheriff. I'm invoking federal authority on suspicion that this case involves matters beyond your jurisdiction. The sheriff hesitated, glancing between Samuel and the boy who stood straighter under the scrutiny. Fine, he finally said, stepping aside, but I'm watching you. Inside the jailhouse was dimly lit and smelled of stale coffee and despair. 2 cells lined the back wall. One stood empty, its door ajar. In the other, a woman sat on a narrow cot, her head bowed, hands folded in her lap. Clara Holden looked up as they approached, her face lighting with shocked relief at the sight of her son. Van, she gasped, rising unsteadily. Oh, thank God. Samuel studied her carefully. Clara was perhaps 35, with dark hair pulled back from a face that might once have been pretty before grief and hardship had etched permanent lines around her eyes and mouth. But it was her hands that caught his attention. They trembled visibly, and her fingers twisted in a way that suggested she couldn't fully control them. Ma! Van rushed to the bars, reaching through to touch her outstretched hand. I found help. Clara's gaze shifted to Samuel, relief giving way to cautious hope. Who? Samuel Blackwood, ma'am, he said, tipping his hat slightly. Your boy found me, or rather I found him trying to steal a horse to reach Cheyenne. A flush of shame colored Clara's pale cheeks. Then you didn't... He did what any son would do, Samuel interrupted gently, and it's fortunate he did. He stepped closer to the cell, lowering his voice. Mrs. Holden, I need to ask you some questions. It's important you answer honestly. Clara nodded, though confusion clouded her features. Have you been experiencing unusual symptoms recently? Tremors, memory lapses, confusion. Her eyes widened in surprise. Yes, but how did you... Has anyone been giving you anything regularly? Food, drink, medicine? Clara hesitated, glancing at the sheriff, who watched from across the room. Judge Hayes ordered that I receive tea each morning. Said it was a Christian kindness before my sentence was carried out. Samuel's expression darkened. One more question. The tremors, when did they start? About 3 weeks ago, she whispered. At first I thought it was just fear, but she held out her hands, which shook despite her efforts to still them. I can't make them stop. Samuel nodded grimly, then turned to the sheriff. Open the cell. The sheriff crossed his arms. On whose authority? Mine, Samuel said, his hand moving to rest meaningfully on his holstered weapon. Unless you'd prefer, I telegraph the federal marshal's office about obstruction of justice. After a tense moment, the sheriff cursed under his breath and reached for his keys. Your funeral, mister. As the cell door swung open, Clara stepped out hesitantly, as if expecting a trick. Van immediately wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face against her side. "Mrs. Holden, I believe you've been deliberately poisoned," Samuel said quietly. "And I think I know who's responsible." Clara's face paled further. "Poisoned? But why would anyone—" "The same reason they've accused you of a murder you didn't commit," Samuel replied, his voice hard with certainty. "The question is what they're trying to hide." The main street was beginning to fill as Samuel led Clara and Van outside the sheriff, following with obvious reluctance. Early morning light glinted off fresh snow, nearly blinding in its intensity. A small crowd had gathered near the gallows, some already taking positions for the grim spectacle planned for that morning. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers as they spotted Clara walking free. A few men stepped forward, faces darkening with anger. "What's this, Sheriff?" demanded a heavy-set man in a butcher's apron. "That woman's supposed to hang Easy Jenkins," the sheriff replied, though he looked uncomfortable. "This here's a federal matter now." "Federal," another man spat on the ground. "She killed Peterson and stole good cattle. We all know it." Samuel's hand moved to his gun as the crowd pressed closer, their faces twisted with the particular rage of those who'd been promised blood and now saw it denied. But before he could speak, another voice cut through the tension. "What is the meaning of this?" The crowd parted reluctantly, revealing a tall, silver-haired man in an immaculate black coat. Despite the years, Samuel recognized him instantly. The same cold blue eyes, the same ramrod-straight posture, the same air of absolute authority that had sent men to their deaths on battlefields across the South. Colonel Gideon Hayes, now Judge Hayes apparently. Hayes's gaze swept over the scene, narrowing when it reached Samuel. For an instant, genuine shock registered on his aristocratic features before his mask of control slipped back into place. "Captain Blackwood," he said, his Virginia accent as pronounced as Samuel remembered. "What an unexpected surprise." "Not as surprising as finding you here, Hayes," Samuel replied coldly. "Playing judge now, are you?" A dangerous smile touched Hayes's thin lips. "Merely serving the cause of justice as always." His gaze shifted to Clara, who had drawn herself up despite her trembling hands. "I see my prisoner has been prematurely released." "She's not your prisoner," Samuel said, "and this execution isn't happening." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "On what grounds?" Samuel stepped forward close enough to see the network of fine red veins in Hayes' eyes. "On the grounds that she's been systematically poisoned while in custody. On the grounds that the trial was a mockery. And on the grounds that I'm opening a federal investigation into the recent suspicious deaths and land seizures in this region." He was bluffing on the last part, but from the flicker of unease that crossed Hayes' face, Samuel knew he had hit a nerve. "That's quite an accusation, Captain," Hayes said, his voice dangerously soft. "One that requires proof." "Which I intend to find," Samuel replied. "In the meantime, Mrs. Holden remains under my protection as a material witness." The crowd had grown larger, watching the confrontation with the avid interest of those who sensed blood in the water. Hayes seemed to become aware of their attention, his expression smoothing into one of judicial concern. "Very well," he said magnanimously. "The law must take its course, however unconventional. You have 24 hours to present your evidence, Captain. After that, justice will proceed as planned." It wasn't a victory, merely a stay of execution. "But for now, it would have to do, ma'am," Samuel said quietly to Clara. "We should go." As they moved toward the horses, Hayes called after them, his voice carrying across the hushed street. "Oh, and Captain, welcome back to Hope's Landing. I do hope your stay proves less fiery than your last." Samuel froze, a cold fury washing over him. The reference to the fire that had claimed his family was unmistakable. Beside him, he felt Clara tense, heard Van's sharp intake of breath. Slowly, deliberately, Samuel turned back to face Hayes. The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath. "We'll see each other again soon, Hayes," Samuel said, his voice deadly quiet. "Count on it." The cabin stood a mile outside town, nestled against a backdrop of pine trees and rocky outcroppings. It was small but solidly built, with a stone chimney that had withstood 3 harsh Wyoming winters. Samuel had constructed it with his own hands after coming west, before bringing Rebecca and Abigail to join him. Before everything changed. "It's not much," Samuel said as he helped Clara down from her horse, "but it's safe." Clara surveyed the cabin with grateful eyes. "It's more than we had in that cell." Inside, a thin layer of dust covered the simple furnishings: a table with 3 chairs, a small iron stove, a bookshelf with a few worn volumes. A door at the back led to a single bedroom. Everything spoke of abandonment, of a life interrupted and never resumed. Van moved immediately to the stove, his experienced hands quickly building a fire with the wood stacked nearby. Clara sank into a chair, her trembling hands clasped tightly in her lap as if to hide their uncontrollable movements. Samuel hung his coat on a peg by the door, then rummaged through a cabinet, producing a tin of coffee and a few basic provisions. When did Hayes arrive in Hope's Landing? He asked, setting a pot of water on the stove. 3 months ago, Clara replied, right after Judge Wheeler's accident. He said he was appointed temporarily by the territorial court, but she hesitated. Things changed quickly after he arrived. How so? Land disputes suddenly resolved in favor of the mining interests. Homesteaders forced out over technicalities. And then Peterson, she broke off, swallowing hard. The man you supposedly killed, Samuel prompted. Clara nodded. He was foreman at the Rocking Bee, the biggest ranch in the county. He'd been making trouble for the smaller homesteaders, cutting fences, diverting water. Then one morning they found him dead by Willow Creek, his throat cut. Someone claimed they saw a woman running from the scene. Her eyes met Samuel's. I was home with Van all night, but Hayes wouldn't allow my alibi. Because the boy's testimony would be biased, Samuel guessed. Yes, and because her hands spasmed suddenly, sending a tremor up her arms. She gasped, grabbing the edge of the table. Samuel was at her side, instantly steadying her. How long has it been since your last dose of the tea? Yesterday morning, she whispered, her face contorted with pain. What's happening to me? Belladonna poisoning, most likely, Samuel said grimly. I've seen it before. During the war. Van looked up sharply from the stove. Poison? Someone's been poisoning Ma. Yes, Samuel confirmed, slowly over weeks, making her appear confused, unstable, perfect for framing. But why? Clara asked, the spasm passing, leaving her even paler than before. Samuel's expression darkened. That's what we need to find out. He poured the now boiling water into 3 cups, stirring coffee into each. But first, we need to get you to a doctor. Van accepted his cup with suspicious eyes. How do you know all this about the poison? Samuel hesitated, old memories surfacing like bodies in a flooded river. I served in the war, saw things I wish I hadn't. He took a deliberate sip of his coffee, including what Hayes is capable of. Clara's gaze grew intent. You knew him during the war. We crossed paths. Samuel's tone made it clear he wouldn't elaborate further. Finish your coffee. We're going to see Dr. Montgomery. As they rode toward town, Samuel remained vigilant, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. The morning had advanced, the sun now high in a pristine blue sky that belied the tension gripping Hope's Landing. They approached from the north, avoiding the main street and its curious onlookers. Dr. Montgomery's house stood at the edge of town, a modest 2-story structure with a small sign identifying it as both home and medical office. Samuel tied their horses at the back entrance, then knocked in a specific pattern, 3 quick raps, a pause, then 2 more. The door opened to reveal a man in his 50s with spectacles perched on a prominent nose and receding gray hair. His expression shifted from irritation to shock when he recognized his visitor. Samuel Blackwood, he breathed. God almighty, I thought you'd left these parts for good. Hello, James, Samuel said. We need your help. The doctor's gaze moved to Clara and Van, understanding dawning in his eyes. The Holden woman, I heard there was a commotion at the jail. He stepped back, ushering them inside. Quickly, before you're seen. Montgomery led them through a tidy kitchen into an examination room lined with shelves of medical books and bottles. He gestured for Clara to sit on the examination table. Mrs. Holden, I'm Dr. James Montgomery. I would have come to see you in jail, but Judge Hayes was quite specific about who could visit. You knew I was ill? Clara asked. Montgomery exchanged a glance with Samuel. I suspected. Several people mentioned your tremors and confusion during the trial. Classic symptoms of certain toxins. He began examining her, checking her pupils, her pulse. How long have you been receiving the tea? 3 weeks, perhaps 4, she replied. It started after they moved me from the sheriff's office to the courthouse cell. Montgomery nodded grimly. Hold out your hands, please. Clara extended her trembling hands. The doctor examined them carefully, noting the involuntary movements, the slight discoloration around her fingernails. Nightshade, he confirmed, looking at Samuel. Belladonna, as you suspected, a slow-acting poison when administered this way. Not immediately fatal, but debilitating. Confusion, tremors, memory lapses, eventual organ failure. Van's face had gone white with anger. They were killing her slowly while pretending to be kind. Yes, Montgomery agreed, turning to his shelves and making her appear unstable, discrediting her claims of innocence. He selected several bottles, mixing their contents in a small glass. This will help with the symptoms, but it's not a cure. The poison must work its way out of your system naturally. How long? Samuel asked. A week, perhaps more. Montgomery handed the glass to Clara. Drink this. It will taste bitter. Clara downed the medicine without complaint, grimacing at the flavor. Thank you, doctor. Montgomery hesitated, then turned to Samuel. There's something else you should know. He glanced meaningfully at Van. Perhaps the boy could wait in the kitchen. Clara nodded to her son, who reluctantly withdrew, closing the door behind him, but not before giving Samuel a look that clearly said he expected to be informed later. Once they were alone, Montgomery's voice dropped to a near whisper. Samuel, I never told you this. Perhaps I should have, but with you leaving town so suddenly after everything. Spit it out, James, Samuel said tensely. The doctor removed his spectacles, pinching the bridge of his nose. Rebecca's death. It wasn't just the fire. Samuel went utterly still. What? I found traces of the same poison in her blood when I examined her body. At the time, I thought perhaps it was contamination from the burning house, the medicines in her cabinet. But seeing Mrs. Holden now, the similarities are unmistakable. The room seemed to tilt around Samuel. You're saying Rebecca was poisoned before the fire? Montgomery nodded gravely. And there's more. Judge Hayes arrived in town just 3 days after the fire. I thought it was coincidence, but now... Samuel's mind raced, connecting dots he'd been too grief-stricken to see 3 years ago. The land disputes that had been brewing, the valuable silver deposits discovered north of town, Rebecca's increasing concern about the homesteaders being forced out. Why didn't you tell me this? Samuel's voice was dangerously quiet. You were half mad with grief, Samuel, Montgomery replied. And then you were gone, vanished into the mountains. What good would it have done? Before Samuel could respond, a sharp knock came at the door, followed by Van's urgent voice. Mr. Blackwood riders, coming up the lane. Samuel moved to the window, carefully pulling back the curtain. 3 men on horseback approached the doctor's house, led by the sheriff. Back door, Montgomery said quickly, already gathering medicines into a small bag. Take these for Mrs. Holden. 3 drops in water twice daily. Samuel accepted the bag, then turned to Clara, who had risen shakily to her feet. Can you ride? She nodded, determination hardening her features despite her obvious weakness. Yes. They slipped out through the kitchen just as a heavy knock sounded at the front door. Van was already untying the horses, his movements quick and practiced. Head for the cabin, Samuel instructed as he helped Clara mount. I'll be right behind you. As Clara and Van urged their horses toward the pines, Samuel lingered long enough to hear Montgomery's voice carrying clearly through the open kitchen window. Sheriff, what a surprise! What brings you here at this hour? Looking for the Holden woman and that so-called lawman. I'm afraid I haven't seen them. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have patients waiting. Samuel slipped away, circling through the trees until he could rejoin Clara and Van on the trail back to the cabin. As they rode, Clara's words drifted back to him on the cold air. Why is he doing this? What could be worth destroying so many lives? Samuel had asked himself the same question many times during the war, watching Hayes order men executed for minor infractions, seeing him sacrifice soldiers for minimal tactical advantages. Power, he answered simply, and whatever's buried in this land that he wants badly enough to kill for. Night fell early, as it always did in Wyoming winters. Samuel stood on the cabin's small porch, watching as the last sliver of sun disappeared behind the western mountains. Stars emerged in the darkening sky, brilliant against the velvet blackness. Inside, Clara had finally fallen into an uneasy sleep on the bed, while Van dozed in a chair by the fire. The boy had refused to leave his mother's side until exhaustion claimed him, his young face troubled even in slumber. Samuel pulled his coat tighter against the biting cold, his breath forming clouds in the still air. 3 years he'd spent trying to outrun his memories, working as a hired gun, a ranch hand, anything to keep moving, to stay one step ahead of the ghosts. Now they had caught up with him. Rebecca. His beautiful, stubborn Rebecca, who had insisted on coming west despite the dangers, who had believed in building a life here, in making a difference, who had died for reasons he was only now beginning to understand. And Abigail, his little girl with her mother's eyes and his obstinate chin, who had trusted him completely to keep the monsters at bay. He had failed them both. The sound of the cabin door opening broke his reverie. Van stepped out, wrapped in a blanket against the cold. You should be sleeping, Samuel said without turning. Can't, the boy replied, moving to stand beside him at the porch railing. Keep thinking about Ma, about what happens if we can't prove she's innocent. Samuel glanced down at the child, noting the determined set of his jaw, the shadows under his eyes that spoke of burdens no boy his age should bear. We'll prove it, he said simply. Van studied him for a long moment. You lost someone too, didn't you? That's why this house feels so empty. Perceptive kid. Samuel hesitated, then nodded. My wife and daughter, 3 years ago. I'm sorry, Van said quietly. Then after a pause, my pa died at Vicksburg. I was 4. Don't remember him much, except he was tall and had a laugh that made the windows shake. Samuel's lips quirked in a small, sad smile. Sounds like a good man. Ma says he was the best, Van agreed. Says I've got his eyes and his knack for finding trouble. He looked up at Samuel again. Did you fight in the war too? I did. Is that how you know Judge Hayes? Samuel's expression hardened. Yes. Something in his tone made Van hesitate before asking his next question. What did he do during the war, I mean? Samuel was silent for so long that Van thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if he were reading from some terrible ledger of memory. He ordered the execution of 16 men, civilians accused of helping Union soldiers escape from a Confederate prison camp. No trial, no evidence. Just Hayes' certainty that they were guilty. Samuel's hands gripped the porch railing. I was there as part of a prisoner exchange. Saw it happen. Later, I testified against him at a military tribunal. Did they punish him? Van asked. No, he had friends in high places, political connections. Samuel's laugh was bitter. He was reprimanded, told to be more judicious in his application of martial law. That was all. Van absorbed this in silence, his young face solemn in the starlight. And now he's here doing the same thing, making up who's guilty. So it seems. The cabin door opened again and Claire appeared leaning heavily against the doorframe. Her face was pale in the moonlight, but her eyes were clearer than they had been earlier. You should be resting, Samuel said, moving quickly to her side. I heard voices, she explained, allowing him to support her as she joined them on the porch. The medicine is helping. I can think more clearly now. Van pressed against her side and she wrapped an arm around his shoulders, her other hand still gripping Samuel's arm for balance. Van, would you check on the fire? Claire asked gently. And perhaps heat some water for tea. The boy looked between them, clearly understanding he was being sent away so the adults could talk. But he nodded, disappearing inside without argument. When they were alone, Clara turned to Samuel, her eyes searching his face. I need to know something, Mr. Blackwood. Samuel, he corrected automatically. Samuel, she conceded with a slight nod. Why are you helping us? You don't know us. This isn't your fight. He looked away toward the distant mountains silhouetted against the night sky. Maybe all fights are the same fight in the end. That's not an answer. Samuel sighed, his breath clouding between them. When I saw your boy trying to steal that horse, desperate to save his mother, it reminded me of something I'd forgotten. What's that? That sometimes helping one person is enough. He paused. My wife used to say that we can't fix the whole world, but we can fix the piece right in front of us. Clara was quiet for a moment. Your wife sounds like a wise woman. She was. The past tense hung between them, an acknowledgement of shared loss. Van told me you lost your family, Claire said softly. I'm sorry. Samuel nodded once, accepting her sympathy without comment. Dr. Montgomery believes my wife was poisoned before the fire. The same poison that's been given to you. Claire's hand tightened on his arm. By Hayes. I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. They stood in silence for a long moment, each lost in thought. Then Clara spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. What happens if we can't prove my innocence by tomorrow? Samuel met her gaze directly. Then we leave. Tonight, if necessary, head north into the mountains. I know places where Hayes and his men wouldn't find us. And live as fugitives. Her voice trembled slightly. What kind of life would that be for Van? A living one, Samuel replied simply. Before Clara could respond, the sound of a rider approaching at speed drew their attention. Samuel's hand moved to his gun, pushing Clara gently toward the door. Get inside, he ordered quietly. Stay away from the windows. Clara hesitated only briefly before obeying, closing the door behind her. Samuel moved to the edge of the porch, concealing himself in the shadows as he tracked the approaching horseman. The rider reined in at the edge of the clearing, his breath and that of his mount forming clouds in the cold night air. For a long moment, he simply sat there scanning the cabin. Then he slowly raised his hands to show they were empty. Captain Blackwood. The voice was hesitant, young. I'm Deputy Marshal Wilson. Dr. Montgomery sent me. Samuel remained in the shadows, gun drawn but not yet raised. Step down from your horse. Slowly. The young man complied, his movements careful. He couldn't have been more than 25, with an earnest face half hidden beneath a thick scarf. What's your business here, Deputy? Samuel called. I have information about the Peterson murder and Judge Hayes. He took a tentative step forward. I've been investigating him for months, sir. Ever since Judge Wheeler's accident. Samuel studied him for a moment longer, then emerged from the shadows, though he kept his gun ready. Why come to me, Doctor? Montgomery said you were a man who'd stand against Hayes regardless of the period. The deputy's voice dropped. And I need help. The sheriff won't listen. He's too afraid. Samuel holstered his weapon with reluctance. Come inside then. But know this, if you're playing us false, you won't leave here alive." The young man nodded, understanding. The threat was not an idle one, Bravo. Inside, Clara had already set another place at the table, her instincts for hospitality overriding their precarious situation. Van watched the newcomer with undisguised suspicion as they settled around the table. "This is Deputy Marshal Wilson," Samuel introduced him. "Says he has information about Hayes." "Thomas, please," the young man said, unwinding his scarf to reveal a boyish face marked by a serious expression. "I've been tracking unusual land acquisitions around Hope's Landing for the past 6 months." "Land acquisitions," Clara repeated. Thomas nodded. "Properties changing hands after accidents, deaths, or criminal charges force the owners out, all eventually purchased by the Western Consolidated Mining Company." He reached into his coat, withdrawing a folded paper. "This is a map. The red marks show properties that have changed ownership. The blue circles indicate unexplained deaths or disappearances." Samuel spread the map on the table. The pattern was unmistakable, a cluster of marked properties forming a rough crescent through the northern part of the county. "And Hayes is connected to this mining company?" Samuel asked. "He sits on their board of directors," Thomas confirmed, "along with several other influential men from Cheyenne and Denver." Clara leaned forward despite her weakness, studying the map. "Our farm is marked in red," she noted, "but we still own it." "For now," Thomas said grimly. "Once you were gone, it would have been seized for taxes, then sold at auction." To Western Consolidated, Samuel finished, the pieces falling into place. "But why these specific properties? What makes this land so valuable?" Thomas hesitated, glancing around as if worried about being overheard despite their isolation. "Silver, a new vein richer than anything found in these parts before. The survey was kept quiet, but I saw the reports in Judge Wheeler's office before his accident." "So that's why Hayes arranged to have Judge Wheeler injured," Samuel said, "to position himself here to manipulate the legal system." "And why he framed Ma," Van added, his young voice hard with anger, "to get our land." Clara reached for her son's hand, squeezing it gently. "But why kill the ranch foreman? Peterson wasn't a landowner." "He was asking questions," Thomas explained, "about the pattern of accidents, about Hayes' sudden appearance in Hope's Landing. He'd been in Cheyenne, talked to people who knew about Hayes' connection to Western Consolidated." Samuel's mind raced, connecting the new information with what he already knew. "And Rebecca," he said quietly, "my wife. She was involved with the Homesteaders Association. She would have noticed what was happening." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table as the implications sank in. It wasn't just about Clara or Peterson. It was about a systematic plan to acquire land by any means necessary, including murder. "What do we do now?" Clara finally asked, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. Samuel folded the map carefully. "We find concrete evidence linking Hayes to Peterson's murder. Something that will stand up in a court of law, a real court, not Hayes' mockery of justice." "And if we can't," Thomas pressed. Samuel's gaze met Clara's across the table, then shifted to Van. In the boy's determined face, he saw echoes of Abigail, the same trust, the same belief that he could make things right. "Then we fight," he said simply, "by whatever means necessary." Later, after Thomas had departed with promises to continue his investigation, and Van had finally succumbed to exhaustion on a makeshift bed near the fire, Samuel found Clara kneeling beside her sleeping son. Her hands, though still trembling, slightly moved with gentle precision as she tucked the blanket more securely around him. In the firelight, with her guard down, she looked both stronger and more vulnerable than she had earlier, a woman accustomed to carrying heavy burdens alone, now finding herself reluctantly dependent on a stranger's help. Feeling his gaze, she looked up. "He looks so young when he sleeps," she whispered. "Sometimes I forget he's just a boy." Samuel nodded, understanding. Children grew up fast in this harsh land, learning to hunt, ride, and work alongside adults from an early age. But they were still children, deserving of protection and care. Clara rose with care, steadying herself against a chair before moving to the cabin's single window. Outside, the night was clear, and cold stars scattered like diamonds across the black velvet sky. "I never thanked you properly," she said without turning, "for believing in my innocence, for helping us." "No need," Samuel replied, uncomfortable with gratitude he wasn't sure he deserved. Clara turned to face him, her expression solemn in the dim light. "There is a need. Few would have done what you did today." She hesitated. "Van told me about your testimony against Hayes during the war, about the civilians who were executed." Samuel's jaw tightened. "I didn't do enough. They still died." "But you tried," she said simply. "That matters." He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Trying wasn't enough. It hadn't been enough for those 16 men, and it hadn't been enough for Rebecca and Abigail. Clara seemed to read his thoughts. "I was a nurse during the war. Did Van tell you that I saw men live who should have died and Dom, who should have lived. Sometimes all we can do is try. And sometimes trying isn't enough. Samuel replied more harshly than he intended. Clara didn't flinch from his bitterness. No, sometimes it isn't. She took a careful step toward him. But we try anyway, because the alternative is to surrender to men like Hayes. And I would rather die on that gallows tomorrow than give him that satisfaction. Her quiet courage struck Samuel like a physical blow. This woman, poisoned and framed facing death, still refused to surrender. While he had spent 3 years running from his ghosts, drowning his grief in whiskey and wanderlust. Something stirred within him, something he'd thought long dead. Purpose, resolve. You won't die tomorrow, he said with a certainty that surprised even him. I promise you that. Clara studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, accepting his promise. Without another word, she moved to the bedroom, pausing at the doorway. Good night, Samuel, she said softly. Good night, Clara, he replied, watching as she disappeared into the darkened room. Alone, Samuel moved to the cabin's single rocking chair, lowering himself into it with the weariness of a man carrying the weight of too many broken promises. He withdrew a small, worn photograph from his pocket. Rebecca and Abigail standing in front of this very cabin, their faces alight with hope for their new life in the West. I'll make it right this time, he whispered to the silent image. I swear it. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, its cry echoing across the moonlit clearing. Samuel sat motionless, listening as the sound faded into the vast Wyoming night. Then, with careful reverence, he returned the photograph to his pocket and began cleaning his revolver, preparing for whatever the dawn might bring. In the bedroom, Clara knelt beside the narrow bed, her trembling hands clasped in prayer. Her whispered words drifted through the thin door. Lord, I do not ask for myself, but please give Van a future and grant this man the peace he deserves. Samuel's hands stilled on his weapon. For the first time in 3 years, he felt something besides grief and rage, something dangerously close to hope. Dawn broke with tentative fingers of pale gold stretching across the eastern sky. Samuel had slept little, spending most of the night in the rocking chair, his revolver across his lap, listening to the subtle sounds of the wilderness around the cabin. Every snapping twig, every whisper of wind had drawn his attention, his body tense with the expectation of danger. Now, as the first true light of day filtered through the cabin's single window, he rose stiffly, stretching muscles knotted from hours of vigilance. The fire had burned down to embers and the morning air held a biting chill. Van still slept curled beneath his blanket near the hearth, his young face peaceful in slumber. Samuel added wood to the fire, coaxing it back to life before putting coffee on to boil. As the rich aroma began to fill the small space, the bedroom door opened and Clara emerged. She looked better than she had the previous day, her eyes clearer, her movement steadier, though still marked by occasional tremors. Morning, Samuel said quietly, mindful of the sleeping boy. Good morning, Clara replied, her voice soft but stronger. You didn't sleep. It wasn't a question. Samuel shrugged, pouring coffee into a chipped mug and offering it to her. Old habits. From the war. She accepted the coffee with both hands, as if needing their combined strength to hold it steady. Partly. He didn't elaborate, turning instead to pour his own cup. They drank in companionable silence, watching as the room gradually brightened with daylight. Outside, birds began their morning chorus, a surprisingly cheerful sound given the circumstances. What happens now? Clara finally asked, her gaze fixed on the window on the new day that might be her last. Samuel set down his empty cup. First, we need to get a sample of that tea Hayes has been giving you. Then we visit the scene where Peterson's body was found. And then we find something to connect Hayes to both. The confidence in his voice was more than he felt, but Clara seemed to draw strength from it, straightening her shoulders as she nodded. Van and I will help however we can. As if summoned by his name, the boy stirred, blinking drowsily before sitting up with sudden alertness. Is it morning already? Just barely, Samuel replied, offering him a cup of water. Drink. We have a long day ahead. They breakfasted on the remaining provisions, dried beef, stale bread, and the last of the coffee. As they ate, Samuel outlined his plan. They would need to separate, covering more ground before Hayes's 24-hour deadline expired. Clara, still weakened by the poison, would return to Dr. Montgomery for further treatment and to secure a sample of the tea. Van, with his smaller size and ability to move unnoticed, would scout the town for any unusual activity around the courthouse. And Samuel would investigate the murder scene at Willow Creek. I don't like splitting up, Van protested, his young face set in stubborn lines reminiscent of his mother. Neither do I, Samuel admitted, but time is against us. The boy's right to be concerned, a new voice interjected. All three whirled toward the door where Mayor Abernathy stood, his hand raised in a placating gesture. Behind him, Dr. Montgomery hovered anxiously. Samuel's gun was in his hand before conscious thought aimed steadily at the mayor's chest. That's far enough. Peace, Captain, Abernathy said calmly. If I meant you harm, I'd have brought the sheriff, not the doctor. How did you find us? Clara demanded, moving protectively closer to Van. This isn't exactly an unknown location, Montgomery replied, stepping past the mayor and into the cabin. And it wasn't hard to guess where Samuel would take you. He set his medical bag on the table. I've come to check on your condition, Mrs. Holden. Samuel lowered his weapon slowly but didn't holster it. Why are you here, Mayor? Abernathy removed his hat, revealing thinning gray hair and a deeply lined face that spoke of years under the harsh Wyoming sun. To warn you, Hayes has called a town meeting for noon today. He's accelerating matters. The 24 hours isn't up until tomorrow, Clara protested. Hayes isn't a man who concerns himself over much with keeping his word, Abernathy replied grimly. He's stirring up the town against you, claiming you've fled justice and that Captain Blackwood is aiding a fugitive. While they spoke, Montgomery had begun examining Clara, checking her pulse and pupils with professional efficiency. The medicine is working, he noted with satisfaction. Your system is beginning to clear the toxin, but not quickly enough, Clara murmured, her hand still visibly trembling. No, Montgomery agreed. It will be days before you're fully recovered. You need rest, good food, clean water. None of which we have time for, Samuel said flatly. He turned to Abernathy. Why are you helping us? Most of the town seems convinced of Mrs. Holden's guilt. The mayor's weathered face hardened. I've lived in Hope's Landing for 30 years, Captain. Seen it grow from a handful of cabins to a proper town. Lately, I've watched good people driven out, honest businesses closed all to serve Hayes and whatever schemes he's brewing. He straightened, a flash of the former military man evident in his bearing. I fought in the Mexican War, sir. I know the difference between justice and tyranny. Samuel studied him for a long moment, weighing his sincerity before giving a curt nod. Then we could use your help. As Montgomery continued his examination of Clara, Abernathy joined Samuel by the window, speaking in low tones. Hayes has been meeting privately with investors from Denver, men with connections to the territorial government and significant mining interests. Western Consolidated, Samuel supplied. Abernathy raised an eyebrow. You know of them. Deputy Marshal Wilson paid us a visit last night, shared some interesting information about land acquisitions in the area. Wilson's a good man, Abernathy agreed. Been trying to build a case against Hayes for months, but the judge is careful, leaves few traces. Not careful enough, Samuel said grimly. He's gotten sloppy with Clara, too eager to claim her land. Across the room, Montgomery had completed his examination and was mixing more medicine for Clara. Van hovered nearby, watching the process with intense interest, asking quiet questions about each ingredient. Your boy has a scientific mind, Mrs. Holden, the doctor remarked. He'd make a fine physician someday. Clara smiled faintly, a mother's pride briefly eclipsing her fear. He's always been curious. His father was the same way. The mention of Van's father drew Samuel's attention. Your husband, he said. He died at Vicksburg. Yes, Clara replied, her expression softening with old grief. Joseph was with the 11th Illinois. He died taking Big Black River Bridge. Samuel nodded solemnly. He remembered that battle, the Union forces charging across the bridge under heavy fire, many falling into the swift current below. Good men lost on both sides. I was a field nurse with the 8th Illinois. Clara continued, accepting the medicine Montgomery offered. That's how we met. Joseph was wounded at Shiloh, brought to my tent. He said later it was love at first sight, though I told him it was more likely the morphine. A faint smile touched Samuel's lips, the first genuine one in longer than he could remember. And after the war, we came west. Joseph had always dreamed of having land of his own. Clara's gaze grew distant. He would have loved the farm we built, the way the sunset turns our wheat fields to gold in the fall. He would have been proud of how you've managed alone, Montgomery said gently. Clara's expression hardened. Not alone, fam, and never alone. I've had Van. She reached for her son's hand, squeezing it briefly before looking back to Samuel. And now it seems unexpected allies. Montgomery closed his medical bag. The medicine I've given you should help with the tremors, but you need to take it regularly, and you need rest. Rest will have to wait, Samuel interjected. Hayes has forced our hand. We need to move now. He turned to Abernathy. Mayor, I need you to delay that town meeting. Buy us a few more hours. Abernathy nodded thoughtfully. I could raise concerns about legal procedure, insist we telegraph the territorial judge in Cheyenne for clarification. Good. Doctor, can you secure a sample of the tea Hayes has been giving Clara? I can try, Montgomery replied, though he's likely destroyed it by now. Then focus on treating Clara. Her recovery is evidence in itself. Van, who had been listening intently, stepped forward. What about me? What can I do? Samuel regarded the boy solemnly. Despite his youth, Van had proven himself resourceful and brave. I need you to show me exactly where Peterson's body was found. Clara started to protest, but Samuel raised a hand. He'll be safer with me than in town where Hayes might use him against you. After a moment's hesitation, Clara nodded reluctantly. Van knows the area well. He can guide you. We'll leave immediately, Samuel decided. Mayor, if you could escort Mrs. Holden back to town, she should be seen returning openly, not as a fugitive. Of course, Abernathy agreed. We'll say she's been under Dr. Montgomery's care all night with my knowledge. Clara rose shakily to her feet. Be careful, she said to Samuel, her eyes communicating far more than her words. Then she turned to her son, drawing him into a fierce embrace. Mind Mr. Blackwood, she whispered against his hair, and come back to me. I will, Ma, Van promised, his voice muffled against her shoulder. We'll fix this. You'll see. Samuel watched their farewell with a hollow ache in his chest, memories of similar goodbyes with Abigail threatening to surface. He pushed them away, focusing instead on the tasks ahead. We should go, he said quietly. Daylight's wasting. Within minutes, they had divided the remaining provisions and separated, Clara departing with Abernathy and Montgomery toward town, while Samuel and Van headed west toward Willow Creek and the site of Peterson's murder. They rode in silence for the first mile, Samuel alert for any sign of pursuit, Van seemingly lost in thought. The morning had warmed slightly, though their breath still clouded in the crisp air. The land around them was beautiful in its stark winter simplicity. Rolling hills dusted with snow stands of pine and aspen, stark against the white distant mountains, rising majestically on the horizon. Mr. Blackwood, Van finally spoke, guiding his horse alongside Samuel's. Can I ask you something? Samuel, he corrected, glancing at the boy. And yes. Do you think we'll really find something evidence that will clear Mom? Samuel considered the question seriously, respecting the boy enough not to offer false comfort. I don't know, he admitted, but we have to try. Van nodded, accepting this honest uncertainty with a maturity beyond his years. That creek up ahead, that's Willow Creek. Peterson was found just around that bend near the big cottonwood. They dismounted at the creek's edge, tethering their horses to a sturdy pine. The water ran swift and clear, partially frozen along the banks where shadows lingered. Samuel surveyed the area carefully, noting the open visibility, the lack of cover. Show me exactly where, he instructed. Van led him to a spot near a massive cottonwood tree, its bare branches reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. Right here. He was lying face down, they said, his throat cut. Samuel crouched, examining the ground. 3 days of snow and wind had erased any obvious signs, but there were still things to be learned from the location itself. It's exposed, he noted. Anyone approaching from the ridge would be seen. Unless it was dark, Van suggested. Even then, the moon was near full that night. Samuel moved toward the creek bank, and crossing the water would have made noise. Van watched him with keen interest. What are you thinking? That Peterson wasn't killed here, Samuel replied, his eyes scanning the area. This is where his body was found, but the murder happened elsewhere. How do you know? No signs of a struggle, no blood on the rocks or snow. Samuel pointed to the ground. And look at the tracks, they've been deliberately obscured, but you can still see where someone dragged something heavy from the trail to this spot. Van's eyes widened with understanding. They wanted it to look like he was killed here, but why to establish a location, Samuel mused, one that could be tied to your mother. The boy's face darkened. Because our farm is just over that ridge. Anyone could claim they saw Ma running from here toward home. Exactly. Samuel continued his careful examination of the area, moving in widening circles from the supposed murder site. Near the base of the cottonwood, partially hidden by exposed roots, he spotted something unusual, a small piece of metal glinting in the morning light. Kneeling, he carefully extracted it from the frozen soil. It was a military button, tarnished but still recognizable with an insignia he knew well, the same insignia that had adorned Hayes' uniform during the war. What is it? Van asked, peering over his shoulder. Evidence, Samuel said grimly, pocketing the button. But not enough. Not yet. They continued their search, Van proving to be an observant and helpful companion. The boy moved with a woodsman's quiet step, his eyes constantly scanning the ground for anything unusual. It was he who discovered the second piece of evidence, a discarded cigar stub half buried in snow, near a cluster of boulders that would have provided cover for anyone watching the creek. Hayes smokes these, Samuel noted, examining the distinctive gold band still visible on the wet tobacco. Imported from Cuba, expensive taste. Is it enough to prove he did it? Van asked hopefully. Samuel shook his head. No, a cigar doesn't make him a murderer, but it places him here watching, and that's a start. As the morning advanced, they widened their search, following the creek upstream toward a small waterfall that cascaded over rock formations. Here the water pooled briefly before continuing its journey, creating a natural resting place for travelers. "Wait," Samuel said suddenly, catching Van's arm as they approached the pool. "Look there." On a flat rock near the water's edge, dark stains marred the surface, brown against the gray stone, easily mistaken for mud or mineral deposits. "Blood," Samuel said quietly, crouching to examine the stains. "Old, but not that old." "Peterson's," Van whispered, his young face solemn. "Maybe." Samuel surveyed the area with new intensity. This would be the place to do it. Private, but accessible. Water to wash away evidence. Van's keen eyes spotted at first a scrap of fabric caught on a thorny bush nearby. "Mr. Blackwood, Samuel, look." The fabric was fine wool, expensive, with a distinctive pattern that Samuel recognized immediately. He'd seen Hayes wearing a vest of identical material just yesterday. "We need to take this back," he said, carefully removing the cloth from the thorns. "And we need to find out where Peterson was before he died, who he spoke with." Van nodded eagerly. "The saloon. Peterson always drank at the Silver Dollar before heading back to the ranch. Everyone knows that." "Good," Samuel said, impressed by the boy's knowledge. "That's our next stop." As they prepared to leave, Samuel cast one final glance around the pool, committing the scene to memory. This was where a man had died, not in defense of his country or in fair combat, but murdered in cold blood to further Hayes' schemes. "We'll get justice for him, too," Samuel promised quietly. "For all of them." Van, already mounted, looked back at him questioningly. "Just thinking aloud," Samuel explained, swinging into his saddle. "Let's head back toward town." They rode at a steady pace, taking a different route than before to avoid being tracked. The day had warmed considerably, the winter sun now high overhead, melting snow on exposed rocks and creating 1,000 tiny cascades that sparkled like diamonds. "Samuel," Van's voice broke the companionable silence. "Were you scared? During the war, I mean." The question caught Samuel off guard. "Yes," he answered honestly. "Only fools aren't scared in war. Ma says my pa was brave, that he died a hero." Van's eyes remained fixed on the trail ahead. "Sometimes I wonder if I'd be brave too, if it came to it." Samuel studied the boy, so young to be contemplating such things, yet forced by circumstances to confront adult realities. "Courage isn't about not being afraid," he said carefully. "It's about doing what's right despite your fear. Like Ma is doing. Yes, like your mother. And like Rebecca had, standing up for the homesteaders despite the risks. Like all those who refused to be silenced by men like Hayes." Van rode in thoughtful silence for a while longer before speaking again. "You know what's strange? Ma doesn't talk much about the war, but sometimes I hear her praying at night, asking forgiveness." "Forgiveness," Samuel echoed, puzzled. "For the men she couldn't save, the ones who died under her care." Van shrugged. "She says every life weighs on her even now." Samuel absorbed this information quietly. He understood that burden all too well, the weight of those you failed to protect, to save. It was a weight he'd carried from the battlefields of the Civil War to the scorched remains of his family home. As they neared the outskirts of Hope's Landing, Samuel signaled for Van to halt. "We'll circle around," he decided. "Approach from the north near the livery. Less chance of being seen." The town appeared peaceful in the midday sun, smoke rising from chimneys, a few people moving along the main street, engaged in ordinary business. But Samuel wasn't fooled by the appearance of normalcy. Beneath the surface tension simmered Hayes, marshaling his allies. The townspeople divided between justice and expedience, Clara fighting not only for her life, but for her son's future. "Stay close," Samuel instructed as they dismounted behind the livery stable. "And if anything happens, you run. Find Dr. Montgomery or the mayor. Understand?" Van looked as though he wanted to argue, but nodded reluctantly. "Yes, sir." "Good. Now let's find out what Peterson knew before he died." The Silver Dollar Saloon stood on the corner of Main Street and Prospect Avenue, its weather-beaten facade a testament to the harsh Wyoming elements. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the sour smell of spilled whiskey. Despite the early hours, several patrons occupied the scattered tables, nursing drinks and conversation in equal measure. Samuel entered first, scanning the room with a lawman's practiced eye. Van followed close behind, his small stature allowing him to slip almost unnoticed among the adults. They settled at a corner table with a clear view of both the entrance and the bar, where a heavy-set man with impressively groomed mutton chops polished glasses with methodical care. "Wait here," Samuel instructed Van. "Keep your head down." The barkeep looked up as Samuel approached, his expression neutral, but assessing. "Help you, stranger?" "Whiskey," Samuel replied, placing a coin on the scarred wooden surface. "And information if you are selling." The man's bushy eyebrows rose slightly. "Information comes at a premium in these parts." Samuel added another coin to the first. I'm interested in Jim Peterson, the ranch foreman who was killed. The barkeep glanced around before leaning closer. You're that lawman, aren't you? The one who stopped the hanging? I am. A moment of consideration, then. Peterson was a regular, came in most evenings, had 3 whiskeys, never more, then headed back to the ranch. He pushed a glass toward Samuel. Night he died, though he was agitated, kept looking over his shoulder, checking the door. Was he expecting someone? Seemed that way. The barkeep's voice dropped further. He'd been in Cheyenne the week before, came back different, worried. Samuel sipped his whiskey, using the motion to mask his intense interest. Did he speak with anyone that night? Just me at first, then Judge Hayes came in. Samuel's pulse quickened. Hayes approached him. Other way around, Peterson saw the judge went straight to his table. They had words, couldn't hear what about, but Peterson was angry. Hayes stayed calm, offered him a cigar. What time did Peterson leave? Around 8. Alone. The barkeep hesitated. Judge stayed another hour drinking with Sheriff Biggs. Then they left together. In the same direction as Peterson. A nod. Toward the creek trail. It's a shortcut to the Rocking Bee. Samuel processed this information, pieces of the puzzle beginning to align. One more question. Did Peterson leave anything here? Something he might have brought back from Cheyenne? The barkeep's expression shuddered. Can't help you there, mister. But his eyes, darting briefly toward a back room, told Samuel otherwise. I think you can, he pressed, sliding a third coin across the bar, and it might save an innocent woman's life. A long moment of indecision, then. Wait here. The barkeep disappeared into the back room, returning moments later with a small, leather-bound notebook. Peterson left this, he said quietly. Asked me to keep it safe. Said if anything happened to him, I should give it to the sheriff. A grimace. But when something did happen, the sheriff was always with Hayes. Didn't seem right. Samuel accepted the notebook, tucking it securely inside his coat. You've done the right thing. Hope so, the man muttered. Now you and the boy better clear out. Hayes has men watching the street. Samuel rejoined Van, gesturing for them to leave through the saloon's back entrance. Outside, in a narrow alley littered with empty bottles and discarded crates. He paused to examine their surroundings, ensuring they weren't observed. What did he tell you? Van whispered eagerly. That Peterson argued with Hayes the night he died, Samuel replied, and that Hayes and the sheriff followed him when he left. Van's eyes widened. So Hayes killed him. It points that way. But we need more. Samuel patted his coat where the notebook rested. And we might have it here. They made their way cautiously through back alleys toward Dr. Montgomery's house, avoiding the main streets where Hayes's men might be watching. The town was busier now, with people gathering near the courthouse. The town meeting Hayes had called was apparently still proceeding, despite the mayor's efforts to delay it. We need to warn Ma, Van said urgently, noticing the crowd. First, we need to see what's in this notebook, Samuel countered. If it contains what I think it does, we'll have the evidence we need to confront Hayes openly. They slipped into Montgomery's house through the back door, finding the doctor alone in his study, surrounded by medical texts and bottles of various remedies. Samuel Van, he greeted them, looking up from a large leather-bound volume. Thank God you're back. Things are moving quickly. Where's Clara? Samuel asked immediately, with Mayor Abernathy at his office. Hayes tried to have her arrested again, but the mayor intervened, claiming she was under his personal supervision as a town matter. Montgomery closed his book. But Hayes is persistent. He's called a special session of the town council for 2 o'clock. Samuel checked his watch, barely an hour from now. Then we need to work fast. We found evidence placing Hayes at the murder scene in this. He produced Peterson's notebook, the ranch foreman's personal journal. He left it at the saloon for safekeeping the night he died. Montgomery's eyes lit with understanding. Let me see. The three gathered around Montgomery's desk as Samuel carefully opened the worn notebook. Inside, Peterson's cramped handwriting filled page after page, daily notations about ranch business, weather conditions, cattle movements. But toward the end, the entries changed in tone and content. September 18th, Samuel read aloud. Rode to Cheyenne on Briggs' orders, delivered papers to the land office as instructed. That would be 2 weeks before his death, Montgomery noted. Samuel continued, September 19th. Something not right with those papers. Land boundaries didn't match our grazing claims. Checked territorial records while in town. Found Western Consolidated Mining has filed overlapping claims on northern sections. The entries grew more concerned as Peterson investigated, further discovering connections between Western Consolidated and several recent accidents that had befallen homesteaders around Hope's Landing. September 23rd. Samuel read, his voice tightening. Discovered Judge G.H. sits on Western's board. Returns to Hope's Landing next week. Must warn Briggs of possible conflict. G.H., Van breathed. Gideon Hayes. And Briggs would be Elijah Briggs, owner of the Rocking Bee, Montgomery supplied. He's been in Denver for months recovering from a riding accident. Samuel turned the page, finding the final entry. September 28th, confronted Hayes tonight. He denied everything, offered settlement. Don't trust him. We'll ride to Denver tomorrow to speak directly with Briggs. If anything happens to me, note that Hayes threatened unfortunate consequences if I pursued the matter. It's a deathbed statement, Montgomery said excitedly, naming Hayes as a potential suspect before the murder occurred. That's powerful evidence. But is it enough? Samuel wondered, scanning the remaining blank pages. A threat isn't proof of murder. There's something else, Van said, suddenly pointing to a bulge in the notebook's back cover. Look. Samuel carefully pried open the leather binding, revealing a folded document hidden in a concealed pocket. He spread it on the desk, a detailed map of Hope's Landing County, with property boundaries marked in different colors. Overlaid on this were additional markings in red ink showing mineral deposits and proposed mining operations. This is it, Montgomery breathed. Peterson must have stolen this from the land office in Cheyenne. It shows Western Consolidated's entire plan, which properties they need to acquire where they intend to mine. And the timing of the accidents matches perfectly with their expansion plans. Samuel noted, tracing the pattern across the map. First the outlying farms, then closer to town, as they secured each section. Van studied the map with intense concentration. Our farm is marked, he said, pointing to a small rectangle outlined in red. And so is yours, Mr. Blackwood. Right over a place marked Silver Deposit B. Samuel's heart pounded as pieces clicked into place. His land, the land where he'd built a home for Rebecca and Abigail, sat directly over one of the richest mineral deposits marked on the map. That's why, he said, his voice barely audible. That's why Hayes came here after the fire, not coincidence. Opportunity. Montgomery looked up sharply. You think he... I don't know yet. Samuel cut him off, unwilling to voice the terrible suspicion forming in his mind. But this map proves motive, for Peterson's murder, for framing Clara, for everything. We need to get this to the town council immediately, Montgomery urged, before Hayes can act. No, Samuel said firmly. We go directly to the people. Hayes controls too many officials. Our only chance is to make this public where he can't suppress it. The town meeting, Van suggested. Everyone will be there. Samuel nodded, gathering the notebook and map. Dr. Montgomery, find Mayor Abernathy and Clara. Bring them to the courthouse at 2 o'clock. Van, you'll come with me. I need you to identify people. Tell me who might be Hayes' allies. What are you going to do? Montgomery asked. Samuel's expression hardened, his hand moving to rest on his holstered revolver. I'm going to confront a murderer. As they prepared to leave, Montgomery stopped them with a raised hand. Wait, there's something else you should know. He moved to a cabinet, unlocking it with a key from his vest pocket. From inside, he withdrew a small glass vial containing dark leaves. I analyzed the tea Hayes was giving Clara, he explained. It's a mixture of belladonna and several other toxins administered in small doses to create cumulative effects without immediate suspicion. Can you testify to that? Samuel asked. Absolutely, and I've documented the progression of her symptoms, her improvement since treatment began. Montgomery's expression grew grave. But there's more. I reviewed my notes from 3 years ago when I examined Rebecca's body after the fire. Samuel went utterly still. And Bishayan, the same toxins were present in her system, Samuel, at higher concentrations, but the same distinctive combination. Montgomery met his gaze directly. Whoever poisoned Clara also poisoned your wife. The room seemed to tilt around Samuel, the floor shifting beneath his feet. He gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles white with tension. Hayes, he said, the name emerging as little more than a whisper. Then louder with a cold fury that made Van step back. Hayes killed my family. We don't know that he started the fire, Montgomery cautioned. But the poisoning, yes. The evidence suggests a connection. Samuel straightened, a terrible calm settling over him. Then we end this today. They departed separately, Montgomery to find the mayor and Clara to Samuel, and Van, making their way toward the courthouse through back streets and alleys. The town was fully awake now, with most businesses closed, as people gathered for Hayes' meeting. American flags fluttered from several buildings, incongruously festive, against the backdrop of brewing conflict. Stay close, Samuel murmured as they approached the courthouse from behind. When we get inside, find your mother and stay with her, no matter what happens. Van nodded solemnly, his young face set with determination. What if Hayes tries to stop you, or if the sheriff does? Samuel checked his revolver one final time before holstering it. Then we'll see what kind of man this town believes me to be. The Hope's Landing courthouse stood at the center of town, a 2-story structure of locally quarried stone with pretensions of grandeur in its columned entrance and domed roof. Inside the main courtroom occupied most of the ground floor, a high-ceilinged chamber with wooden benches for spectators, a raised dais for the judge, and a railed enclosure for defendants. By the time Samuel and Van slipped in through a side entrance, the room was nearly full. Townspeople filled the benches, their voices creating a low murmur of anticipation. At the front, Hayes sat in the judge's chair, flanked by Sheriff Biggs and several deputies. Mayor Abernathy stood to one side, his face tight with controlled anger. And there, seated in the defendant's area, was Clara, pale but composed, her hands folded in her lap to hide their lingering tremors. Samuel scanned the crowd, identifying potential allies and enemies. Most seemed merely curious, drawn by the promise of drama, rather than any strong conviction about Clara's guilt or innocence. A few, particularly the larger landowners near the front, watched Hayes with expressions of deference that suggested financial or political ties. "Stay here," Samuel whispered to Van, positioning the boy near the wall where he could remain inconspicuous. "Wait until I call for you." With that, he straightened his coat, checked that Peterson's notebook and the map were secure in his inner pocket, and stepped into the center aisle. The reaction was immediate, heads turning, conversations faltering, a wave of awareness spreading through the room like ripples in a pond. Hayes looked up from the document he'd been reviewing, his cold eyes narrowing at the sight of Samuel advancing toward the front. "Captain Blackwood," he called, his voice carrying easily in the suddenly quiet room. "How good of you to join us. We were just discussing the unfortunate escape of our prisoner." "She didn't escape," Samuel replied evenly, continuing his measured approach. "She was released into my custody as a material witness in a federal investigation." "A federal investigation?" Hayes raised an eyebrow, his tone mocking. "How interesting. And what exactly are you investigating, Captain, besides ways to obstruct local justice?" Samuel reached the front of the room, positioning himself between Hayes and Clara. He could feel her gaze on him, sense her tension even without looking. "Murder," Samuel said simply, "and conspiracy, fraud, corruption of public officials." A murmur swept through the crowd. Hayes' expression hardened, though his voice remained controlled. "Serious charges. I assume you have evidence to support these wild accusations." "I do." Samuel turned to face the assembled townspeople. 3 days ago, Jim Peterson was found murdered near Willow Creek. Mrs. Holden was accused of the crime based on flimsy evidence and the word of a single anonymous witness who claimed to see a woman fleeing the scene. "The evidence was sufficient for an indictment," Hayes interjected smoothly. This court," Samuel cut him off, "is presided over by a man with direct financial interest in the outcome, a man who deliberately poisoned the defendant to make her appear unstable and guilty." Gasps and exclamations erupted from the spectators. Hayes rose to his feet, face flushing with anger. "That is outrageous! Sheriff, remove this man!" Sheriff Biggs stepped forward, hand moving to his holster, but froze when Samuel fixed him with a cold stare. "Before you do that, Sheriff, you might want to hear what Peterson wrote in his journal the night he died." Samuel withdrew the notebook, opening it to the final entry. After returning from Cheyenne, where he discovered Judge Hayes' connection to Western Consolidated Mining and their plans to seize land throughout this county. "This is absurd." Hayes sputtered, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Samuel read aloud from the journal, his clear voice carrying to every corner of the now silent courtroom. When he finished, he held up the map found in the notebook's hidden pocket. "This map shows Western Consolidated's entire plan, which properties they need to acquire, where they intend to mine. It also shows quite clearly that every accident and unexplained death in Hope's Landing over the past year corresponds exactly with their expansion needs." Mayor Abernathy stepped forward. "May I see that map, Captain?" Samuel handed it over. The mayor studied it carefully, his expression growing increasingly grave. "My God," he murmured, "my own property is marked, as are half the businesses in town." Hayes slammed his gavel down. "This is all conjecture and fabrication. That journal could have been written by anyone at any time." "Perhaps," Samuel conceded, "but it's not the only evidence." He turned to Dr. Montgomery, who had entered quietly during the commotion. "Doctor, would you share your findings regarding Mrs. Holden's condition?" Montgomery stepped forward, professional dignity evident in his bearing. "Mrs. Holden has been systematically poisoned with the combination of belladonna and other toxins administered through tea provided on Judge Hayes' specific orders. This poisoning caused tremors, confusion, and memory lapses, symptoms that were then used to discredit her during her trial." "Well, and how convenient that the town's only doctor should suddenly discover this poisoning after the trial concluded," Hayes sneered. "Perhaps your professional judgment has been compromised by your friendship with Captain Blackwood." "My findings can be verified by any qualified physician," Montgomery replied stiffly. "Furthermore, I've documented Mrs. Holden's improvement since treatment began, improvement that would be impossible if her symptoms were natural or feigned." Samuel moved closer to Hayes, his voice dropping to ensure only the judge could hear his next words. I also know about Rebecca, the same poison haze, the same signature. Did you start the fire to cover your tracks, or was that just a fortunate accident? Hayes's face drained of color confirmation enough for Samuel. Louder for the entire room to hear, he continued. Judge Hayes arrived in Hope's Landing 3 days after my family died in a fire. A fire that destroyed our home, which sits directly above one of the richest silver deposits marked on this map. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Clara rose from her seat, moving to stand beside Samuel despite the sheriff's warning gesture. My farm is similarly marked, she said, her voice steady despite her weakness, as are the properties of 3 other families who have faced accidents or criminal charges in recent months. Hayes had recovered his composure, his aristocratic features settling into lines of affronted dignity. These accusations are not only false, but defamatory. Sheriff, I order you to arrest Captain Blackwood and return Mrs. Holden to custody immediately. Sheriff Biggs hesitated, glancing between Hayes and the increasingly restless crowd. Before he could act, the courthouse doors burst open and Deputy Marshal Wilson strode in, accompanied by 2 uniformed federal marshals. Judge Gideon Hayes, Wilson announced formally, you are under arrest for the murder of James Peterson, conspiracy to commit fraud and corruption of public office. Hayes's face contorted with rage. This is outrageous. I am a federal judge. You are a territorial judge temporarily appointed, Wilson corrected, and as of this morning officially suspended, pending investigation by order of the territorial governor. He produced an official document bearing the governor's seal. Mayor Abernathy, as the senior elected official present, would you witness this arrest? Abernathy stepped forward eagerly. With pleasure, Marshal. As one of the federal marshals moved to handcuff Hayes, the judge suddenly lunged sideways, shoving past Sheriff Biggs and drawing a small derringer from his coat pocket. The crowd scattered in panic, women screaming, men diving for cover. Back, Hayes shouted, his cultured voice now ragged with desperation. All of you back! His wild gaze fixed on Samuel. This is your doing, Blackwood. You've hounded me since the war, unable to accept that sometimes harsh measures are necessary for progress. Murder is in progress, Samuel replied evenly, keeping his hands visible, aware that Clara stood just behind him. It's just murder. Hayes's laugh was brittle. Such moral certainty, yet you've killed men too, haven't you, Captain, in battle and after? That's the truth of the frontier. Blood waters the garden of civilization. The difference is I can face my actions, Samuel said. Can you? For a moment it seemed Hayes might surrender, his shoulders sagging slightly. Then his expression hardened, and he raised the derringer not toward Samuel, but toward Clara. Perhaps one more death will clarify matters, he snarled. Samuel moved without conscious thought, lunging forward as Hayes fired. Pain exploded in his left shoulder, spinning him half around, but his momentum carried him into Hayes, driving them both to the floor. The derringer skittered away across the polished wood. Chaos erupted, people shouting, running, the federal marshals fighting through the panicked crowd. Samuel barely registered any of it, focused entirely on Hayes, who struggled beneath him with surprising strength for a man his age. You should have stayed gone, Blackwood. Hayes hissed, his aristocratic mask completely shattered. You could have lived out your days in ignorance. You killed my family. Samuel growled, his wounded shoulder screaming in protest as he pinned Hayes down. Progress requires sacrifice. Hayes replied, his eyes cold and empty of remorse. Nothing personal, just business. Something snapped in Samuel, then a final tether of restraint of civilization. His hands moved to Hayes's throat, tightening with deadly intent. The judge's eyes bulged, his face purpling, as he clawed ineffectively at Samuel's grip. Samuel, no! Clara's voice cut through the red haze of his rage. Not like this. Not for me. Not for us. Her hand touched his uninjured shoulder, gentle but insistent. He'll face justice. The proper way. For a terrible moment, Samuel's hands remained locked around Hayes's throat, every fiber of his being demanding retribution for Rebecca, for Abigail, for the 3 years of empty grief. Then slowly his fingers relaxed. Hayes gasped for air, coughing violently, as the marshals finally reached them, roughly hauling the judge to his feet and securing his hands behind his back. Samuel remained kneeling, suddenly aware of the warm wetness spreading across his shirt, the metallic taste of blood in his mouth. Clara crouched beside him, pressing a handkerchief to his wound. You're hit, she said unnecessarily, her face tight with concern. Not badly, he managed, though the room had begun to tilt alarmingly. Ma Samuel. Van pushed through the dispersing crowd, his young face pale with fear, as he took in Samuel's bloodied condition. It's all right, Clara reassured her son, though her trembling hands belied her calm words. He's going to be fine. Help me get him to Dr. Montgomery's. The next hours passed in a blur for Samuel Montgomery, extracting the bullet from his shoulder, the sting of antiseptic, the dull throb of pain beneath bandages. Clara remained at his side throughout her nursing experience, evident in the efficient way she assisted the doctor, anticipating needs before they were voiced. By evening, he was installed in Montgomery's spare bedroom, propped up with pillows, reluctantly accepting the laudanum the doctor prescribed for pain. Through the window, he could see lanterns being lit along the main street, their warm glow pushing back against the gathering darkness. A soft knock preceded Clara's entrance, Van following close behind. The boy carried a tray with soup and bread, while Clara brought fresh bandages. "How are you feeling?" she asked, setting the bandages aside to feel his forehead for fever. "I've had worse," Samuel replied, though in truth the wound pained him more than he wanted to admit. "What's happening in town?" "Hayes and Sheriff Biggs are in custody," Clara reported, helping Van set up the tray across Samuel's lap. "The federal marshals took statements from everyone at the courthouse. They'll be transported to Cheyenne tomorrow for formal charges. And the town council has appointed Mayor Abernathy as acting judge until territorial authorities can send a replacement." Van added proudly, clearly pleased to be sharing important news. "The mayor's first act was to officially dismiss all charges against me." Clara continued, a faint smile touching her lips. "I'm a free woman thanks to you." Samuel shook his head slightly. "You would have found a way. You're stubborn enough." Her smile widened. "Perhaps, but it would have been difficult from the gallows." Van, having arranged the meal to his satisfaction, looked between them with solemn eyes. "What happens now, to us, I mean?" A good question, and one Samuel had been pondering through the haze of pain and medication. What did happen now? With Hayes captured and Clara exonerated, his immediate purpose was fulfilled. Yet the thought of returning to his solitary existence, drifting from town to town, job to job, held no appeal. "You'll go home," he said finally. "Back to your farm. Rebuild what Hayes tried to take from you." Clara's expression was unreadable. "And you," Samuel hesitated. 3 years he'd spent running from his grief, from the charred ruins of his hopes. Perhaps it was time to stop running. "I have a place too," he said quietly. "Land that's been sitting empty too long." Understanding dawned in Clara's eyes. "Your homestead." Samuel nodded. "It needs work. Everything does after the fire, but the land is good." "As is ours," Clara said carefully, "though managing alone has been challenging." Van looked between them again, a cautious hope dawning on his young face. "Maybe we could help each other sometimes. Neighbors do that right." Samuel met Clara's gaze over the boy's head, reading the same tentative possibility in her eyes that he felt stirring in his own heart. "Yes," he agreed softly. "Neighbors do that." Outside, snow began to fall again, large flakes drifting past the window, like gentle messengers from a kinder world. Inside, in the warm lamplight, 3 survivors of Hayes's ambition sat together, sharing a simple meal and simpler conversation, finding in each other's company a peace long absent from their separate lives. It wasn't a declaration or a promise, not yet, but it was a beginning, and for now, that was enough. The first snowfall of February blanketed Hope's Landing in pristine white, transforming the rugged frontier town into a scene from a Christmas card. Smoke curled from chimneys into the crisp morning air, and the mountains beyond the settlement stood like sentinel, their peaks gleaming in the winter sun. At Dr. Montgomery's house, Samuel sat by the window, watching the town come to life, despite the early hour and bitter cold. His wounded shoulder ached less today, the dull throb manageable without laudanum, a fact for which he was grateful. He disliked the foggy thinking the medicine induced, the way it blurred the edges of reality. 4 days had passed since Hayes' arrest. 4 days of recovery, of statements to federal marshals, of gradually piecing together the full extent of the former judge's crimes. And 4 days of Clara's steady presence, her capable hands changing his bandages, her quiet voice reading aloud from Montgomery's collection of books during the long evenings. A soft knock at the door pulled Samuel from his thoughts. Clara entered, carrying a tray with coffee and fresh biscuits, Van trailing behind her with a newspaper tucked under his arm. "You're up early," she observed, setting the tray on the bedside table. "Couldn't sleep," Samuel admitted. The nightmares had returned, vivid dreams of fire and screaming of Rebecca calling his name as flames consumed their home. But there was something new in these dreams, something that left him uneasy upon waking Hayes standing in the shadows watching with cold satisfaction. Clara studied his face with a nurse's perceptive eye. The pain manageable. He accepted the coffee she offered, inhaling the rich aroma with appreciation. "What news?" Van eagerly unfolded the newspaper, the Hope's Landing Gazette, its front page dominated by the continuing scandal. "The federal investigation is expanding," he reported, scanning the article. "They've arrested 3 members of the Western Consolidated Board in Denver. and they're reviewing all of Hayes's judicial decisions for the past year. Good, Samuel said grimly. Justice was slowly grinding forward, though no punishment would ever be sufficient for what Hayes had done not just to Clara, but to all those whose lives he had destroyed in his quest for power and wealth. Clara settled into a chair near the bed, her hands steadier now, though still occasionally betraying a slight tremor, folded in her lap. Dr. Montgomery says you can be moved tomorrow if you wish, to recover somewhere more comfortable than his spare room. The question beneath her statement hung unspoken between them. Where would he go? His own homestead remained uninhabitable, the burned shell of the cabin, a monument to loss that he had avoided for 3 years. Before Samuel could respond, another knock sounded more authoritative than Clara's had been. Doctor. Montgomery appeared in the doorway, his expression both excited and troubled. Samuel, you have visitors, Mayor Abernathy and Reverend Thaddeus from the Mountain Chapel. Samuel straightened, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his healing wound. Show them in. Clara rose. We should give you privacy. Stay, Samuel said quickly, surprising himself with the urgency in his voice. Please. She hesitated, then nodded, resuming her seat. Van perched on the windowsill, his young face alight with curiosity. Mayor Abernathy entered first, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. Behind him came a tall, gaunt man with a silver beard and piercing blue eyes, Reverend Thaddeus, whom Samuel vaguely remembered from before the fire. The mountain preacher rarely came to town, preferring the solitude of his small chapel built into the side of Eagle Mountain. Captain Blackwood, Abernathy greeted him. You're looking better than when I last saw you. Mayor, Samuel acknowledged. Reverend, this is unexpected. Indeed. Thaddeus's voice was deep and resonant, a preacher's voice meant to carry over open plains or to the back pews of a crowded church. But necessary, I believe. The two men remained standing, exchanging glances that suggested some private communication. Finally, Thaddeus spoke again. I've come about Rebecca. Samuel went utterly still, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. Beside him, he sensed Clara's sudden tension, her instinctive shift closer to him, a gesture of support or protection, perhaps both. What about her? Samuel asked, his voice carefully neutral. Thaddeus reached into his coat and withdrew a worn Bible, its leather cover cracked with age and use. She came to me before the fire. She was troubled, seeking guidance. Troubled about what? The Homesteaders Association. The land disputes. Thaddeus ran a weathered hand over the Bible's cover. She had discovered something: patterns in the accidents befalling local farmers, connections to mining interests in Denver. Samuel's mind raced. Rebecca had never mentioned visits to the mountain preacher, though she had been increasingly preoccupied in the weeks before the fire. She told you this. Not all of it, but she left something in my keeping. Thaddeus opened the Bible, revealing a hollow carved into its pages, a hiding place containing a sealed envelope. She said if anything happened to her, I should ensure this reached the proper authorities. Why didn't you come forward before now? Samuel demanded, anger flaring at the thought of evidence withheld for 3 years. I tried. Thaddeus replied, his expression grave. The day after the fire, I rode to town. But Judge Hayes had already arrived. When I asked to speak with the sheriff about Rebecca's concerns, I was discouraged. Threatened? Abernathy clarified, his face darkening with remembered outrage. Biggs told him to return to his mountain and mind his own affairs, or risk having his chapel declared unsafe and demolished. So I waited, Thaddeus continued, watched, prayed for guidance. When I heard you had returned, confronting Hayes openly, I knew the time had come. He handed the envelope to Samuel, who accepted it with a hand that wasn't quite steady. The paper was yellowed with age, the seal unbroken. Written across the front, in Rebecca's familiar flowing script, was a simple instruction: to be opened in the event of my death. Samuel stared at his wife's handwriting, emotions warring within him. Grief, anger, a desperate hunger to hear her voice once more, even in written form. But also fear of what the letter might contain, what final revelations might shatter the fragile peace he had begun to find. Would you like us to leave? Claire asked softly, her hand resting lightly on his uninjured arm. Samuel shook his head. No. He looked up at Thaddeus and Abernathy. But I would ask for some time alone before we discuss this further. The men nodded in understanding. We'll return this afternoon, Abernathy said. There are other matters we should discuss as well, about Hayes's trial and the future of the properties he targeted. After they departed, silence filled the room. Van, sensing the gravity of the moment, slipped quietly out, murmuring something about helping Dr. Montgomery with his morning rounds. Clara remained her presence an anchor in the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm Samuel. You don't have to read it now, she said gently. Or ever, if that's your choice. Samuel traced Rebecca's handwriting with his fingertip. I've spent 3 years running from her memory, he said, his voice rough with suppressed feeling. It's time to stop running. With careful movements, he broke the seal and unfolded the letter within. 2 pages covered in Rebecca's handwriting, the ink slightly faded but still legible. Taking a deep breath, he began to read. My dearest Samuel, if you are reading this, then my fears have proven justified and I am gone. Forgive me for not sharing these concerns with you directly. I wanted proof before alarming you, and I feared putting you in danger. Over the past months, I have discovered something disturbing about the accidents befalling our neighbors. Thomas Jenkins' barn fire, the widow Parker's sudden illness, the Millers' decision to sell and move east after their well, was contaminated. None were coincidental. I traced land sales records in the county office and found a pattern. Each property after disaster struck was eventually purchased by Western Consolidated Mining through various intermediaries. The company itself is controlled by a consortium of investors from Denver, including several with political connections in the territorial government. One name appears consistently in the documentation, Colonel Gideon Hayes, whom you knew during the war. He is scheduled to visit Hope's Landing next month as part of a judicial circuit. I believe his true purpose is to oversee the next phase of land acquisition. Samuel, our land is among those targeted. Geological surveys indicate a silver vein running beneath our property and several adjacent homesteads. I found a map in the land office showing planned mining operations that would destroy everything we've built. I've gathered documentation and entrusted copies to Reverend Thaddeus and to my friend Clara Holden, a nurse I met through the Homesteaders Association. If anything happens to me, they will know how to proceed. My love, if I am gone, do not let grief consume you. Abigail needs her father's strength and guidance, and the people of Hope's Landing need someone who will stand against the corruption threatening their futures. Remember your promise to me under the stars that first night in our new home, that we would build something that would last, something worthy of leaving to our children. With all my love through this life and beyond, Rebecca. Samuel lowered the letter, his vision blurred with unshed tears. Clara, his Clara, had known Rebecca, had been entrusted with information that might have prevented the fire had events unfolded differently. You knew her, he said, his voice barely audible. Clara nodded, her own eyes bright with emotion. Yes, through the Homesteaders Association. She was remarkable, determined to help everyone to build a true community here. She never mentioned you. We agreed it was safer that way. Clara hesitated. She was worried about you, about how you would react if you knew how deeply she was investigating these matters. She feared you might confront Hayes directly, putting yourself in danger. Samuel absorbed this in silence, conflicting emotions warring within him. Part of him felt betrayed that Rebecca had kept such secrets, had not trusted him with her discoveries and fears. Yet another part recognized the fierce protectiveness behind her decision, the same instinct that had driven him to shield her and Abigail from the darker realities of his wartime experiences. Did she give you documents? He asked finally. Yes, land records correspondence between Western Consolidated and their agents here. Clara's expression grew troubled. I hid them at our farm beneath a loose floorboard in the root cellar. After Rebecca's death, I continued gathering evidence, trying to understand what was happening. Then Hayes arrived and things began moving more quickly. Until he targeted you directly. Clara nodded. Peterson came to me the week before he died. He'd discovered my connection to Rebecca, knew I was still investigating. He shared what he'd learned in Cheyenne. Her hands trembled slightly and she clasped them tightly together. 2 days later, he was dead and I was arrested for his murder. Samuel looked down at Rebecca's letter again, at the familiar curves and lines of her handwriting. She had been investigating Hayes, gathering evidence against him. And Hayes had silenced her, just as he had later silenced Peterson. She died because of what she knew. Samuel said the realization settling like a stone in his chest, because she was trying to protect our community, our home. Yes, Clara's voice was gentle but unflinching, and she would want you to finish what she started, to ensure Hayes and his conspirators face justice for all their crimes, not just those against me or Peterson. Samuel carefully refolded the letter, his decision crystallizing with each movement. We need to retrieve those documents. They could be crucial evidence at Hayes's trial. The farm is a day's ride, Clara said, and you're still recovering. I've ridden with worse, Samuel replied, already calculating what they would need for the journey. We'll leave tomorrow at first light. Clara studied him for a moment, then nodded decisively. I'll speak with Dr. Montgomery about provisions and proper care for your wound during travel. She rose, her practical nature asserting itself now that a course of action had been determined. And I'll have Van prepare the horses. As she moved toward the door, Samuel called after her. Clara. She paused, looking back at him. Thank you for being Rebecca's friend, for continuing her work when she couldn't. Clara's expression softened. She loved you very much, Samuel, Even when she was most afraid, she never doubted you would make things right if anything happened to her. A gentle smile touched her lips. It seems she knew you better than you knew yourself. After she left, Samuel sat for a long time with Rebecca's letter in his hands, reading and rereading her final words to him. Gradually, the weight of failure and grief that had burdened him for 3 years began to shift, transforming into something else. A renewed sense of purpose, a determination to honor her memory not through endless mourning, but through completing the work she had begun. Outside, snow continued to fall, each flake a silent promise of renewal, of fresh beginnings built upon the buried past. The journey to Clara's farm began in the crystalline cold of early morning frost glittering on every surface as the first rays of sunlight pierced the eastern horizon. Dr. Montgomery had protested Samuel's decision to travel, citing his still healing wound and the risk of reopening it during the long ride. But in the end, even the doctor recognized the steel in Samuel's resolve and limited himself to providing extra bandages and a small bottle of laudanum for emergencies only. They traveled light, Samuel, Clara, and Van on horseback, with a single pack mule carrying essential supplies. Mayor Abernathy had offered men to accompany them, concerned about possible retaliation from Hayes's remaining allies, but Samuel had declined. Speed and stealth would serve them better than numbers. The farm lies 15 miles east, Clara explained, as they rode single file along a narrow trail that wound through pine forests and across open meadows blanketed in snow. We should reach it by midday if the weather holds. Samuel nodded, adjusting his position in the saddle to ease the persistent ache in his shoulder. The wound was healing well, according to Montgomery, but the constant movement of riding tested his endurance. He would not complain, however, not when Clara had endured worse during her poisoning, not when so much depended on the documents hidden at her homestead. Van rode ahead, his small figure alert in the saddle as he scouted the trail. The boy had blossomed in the days since Hayes's arrest, his natural resilience reasserting itself now that the immediate threat to his mother had passed. Samuel found himself increasingly impressed by Van's quiet competency, his intuitive understanding of situations that would challenge many adults. "He's like his father that way," Clara remarked, as if reading Samuel's thoughts. Joseph could size up a battlefield or a broken fence with the same thoughtful gaze. "You miss him still," Samuel observed. "Every day," she admitted, "but differently now. The sharp pain has softened into something I can carry without being crippled by it." She glanced at him. "You understand?" It wasn't a question, but Samuel nodded anyway. Yes. And he did, he realized. Somewhere in the crucible of the past week, his own grief had begun to transform, not vanishing but changing form, becoming something that could coexist with hope, even with joy. They rode in comfortable silence after that, each lost in private thoughts, as the miles passed beneath their horses' hooves. Around midday, as Clara had predicted, they crested a low-rise and the Holden farm came into view in the valley below. It was a modest homestead, a small cabin with a covered porch, a barn, weathered to silver-gray fenced pastures where cattle would graze in warmer seasons. A creek wound through the property, partially frozen now, but still flowing in the center where the current ran strongest. "Home," Van said simply, his young face lighting with pleasure at the sight. Clara's expression was more complex, relief at returning certainly, but also wariness. "It looks undisturbed," she noted, "but we should approach carefully." Samuel agreed. The news of Hayes's arrest would have reached his associates by now, and there was a chance someone might have connected Clara to Rebecca's investigation. "Van, circle around through the trees," he instructed. "Watch the property for a few minutes before approaching. If you see anything unusual, ride back immediately." The boy nodded solemnly, accepting the responsibility without question. He guided his horse off the trail and into the cover of the pines, soon disappearing from view. "He's too young for such burdens," Clara murmured, watching him go. "Perhaps," Samuel conceded, "but he bears them well." They waited, scanning the homestead for any sign of disturbance or unwelcome visitors. Everything appeared peaceful, smoke rising from the cabin chimney, which meant the fire they'd banked before leaving for town was still smoldering snow, undisturbed across the yard. Van reappeared after 10 minutes, emerging from the trees near the barn. "All clear?" he called, waving them forward. No tracks, except some deer and maybe a fox. Relieved, they rode down to the cabin. As they dismounted, Samuel noted the care with which the Holdens had built their home. The solid construction, the thoughtful details like the covered woodpile near the door. The stone path that would prevent mud in the spring thaw. This was a place created with love and intention meant to last generations. Inside the cabin was cold but welcoming, with simple furniture arranged around a central hearth. Van immediately set about rekindling the fire while Clara moved through the rooms, checking that everything was as they had left it. "The root cellar is outside," she explained, returning with a lantern, "behind the cabin covered by the storm doors." Samuel followed her out, his hand instinctively resting near his holstered revolver, despite Van's all clear. Years as a lawman had taught him that danger often lurked where least expected. The root cellar doors were partially covered with snow, which Clara brushed away before pulling them open to reveal stone steps descending into darkness. The lantern cast eerie shadows as they made their way down into the cool earth-scented space below. Root vegetables hung in nets from the ceiling, and shelves along the walls held rows of preserves, Clara's preparations for the winter months. At the far end, a small clearing had been left in the packed earth floor. Here, Clara said, kneeling to press on a specific floorboard. It lifted easily, revealing a cavity beneath. From this hiding place, she withdrew a oilskin-wrapped package, handing it to Samuel with a solemnity that matched the moment. Rebecca's research. And mine. Samuel accepted the package. Its weight, seemingly greater than mere paper, should be the weight of truth of evidence that could finally bring Hayes to justice for all his crimes. There's something else, Clara added, reaching deeper into the hiding place. Something I found after Peterson's death. She produced a smaller package, this one wrapped in a scrap of familiar fabric, the same material as the vest Hayes had been wearing the day of the confrontation in the courthouse. Where did you get this? Samuel asked sharply. From Peterson's saddlebag. He must have torn it during their struggle. Clara unwrapped the fabric, revealing a small leather-bound ledger. It's a record of payments. Bribes to officials, compensation to men who carried out accidents, shares of profits distributed to Hayes' co-conspirators. Samuel opened the ledger, scanning the meticulous entries, dates, amounts, initials that would correspond to recipients. This is a confession in Hayes' own hand, he breathed, enough to convict him and everyone involved. I was going to bring it forward, Clara explained, but then I was arrested. I didn't dare tell anyone where it was hidden for fear Hayes would find it and destroy the evidence. Samuel carefully rewrapped both packages, securing them inside his coat. You've been extraordinarily brave, Clara. Few would have continued fighting under such circumstances. She shook her head slightly. Not brave, just stubborn, and perhaps a little foolish. Sometimes those qualities serve us better than courage, Samuel replied, a smile briefly touching his lips. They climbed back into the daylight, securing the cellar doors behind them. Van had the fire blazing now, and the cabin had begun to warm, driving away the winter chill. The boy had also started preparing a simple meal from the provisions they'd brought, coffee bubbling on the stove, dried beef soaking, to soften it, biscuits from Dr. Montgomery's kitchen laid out on a plate. We should eat before heading back, Clara suggested. Regain our strength for the return journey. Samuel agreed, though part of him was anxious to deliver the evidence to the federal marshals as quickly as possible. The documents represented the culmination of Rebecca's work, the key to justice not just for her death, but for all those Hayes had harmed in his ruthless pursuit of wealth and power. As they settled around a small table, the domesticity of the scene struck Samuel with unexpected force. How long had it been since he'd shared a meal in a family home with people who mattered to him? 3 years of drifting, of taking his meals alone in saloons, or around campfires, avoiding connections that might lead to more pain. Yet here he sat with Clara quietly pouring coffee and Van eagerly describing how he planned to replant the vegetable garden come spring, and Samuel felt something he had thought forever lost to him, a sense of belonging. Samuel, Clara's voice drew him from his thoughts. You've gone quiet. Just thinking, he replied, about how quickly things change. She studied him over the rim of her coffee cup, her perceptive gaze seeming to read more in his expression than he had intended to reveal. For better, I hope. Yes, he said simply, for better. The meal was brief, but nourishing, the conversation easy and unforced. As they prepared to depart, Clara moved through the cabin one last time, checking that everything was secure for their absence. We'll come back soon, she told Van, who was clearly reluctant to leave home again so quickly. Once Hayes' trial is arranged and these documents are safely delivered. The boy nodded, though his expression remained wistful as he glanced around the cabin, the only home he could remember, the place where his father's memory lived most vividly. They had just finished saddling the horses when Samuel heard the distant thunder of approaching riders, too many and too fast for innocent travelers. Inside, he ordered sharply. Now. Clara and Van didn't hesitate, immediately abandoning the horses and rushing toward the cabin. Samuel followed, his revolver drawn, mind racing as he calculated their options. The cabin was sturdy, but not built for defense. The windows were vulnerable, the doors substantial, but not impenetrable. Bar the door, he instructed as they entered. Van, get away from the windows. Clara, is there another way out? The back door through the kitchen, she replied, moving swiftly to secure the front entrance. But it leads to open ground before the tree line. We'd be exposed. Samuel crossed to a window, carefully peering out from the side to avoid presenting a target. The riders were visible now, 6 men approaching, fast rifles evident even at this distance. Hayes's men, he concluded grimly, probably sent to destroy the evidence before we could find it. What do we do? Van asked, his voice steady despite the fear evident in his eyes. Samuel made a rapid assessment of their situation. They were outnumbered but had the advantage of shelter. He had his revolver and a rifle from Montgomery, plus whatever weapons the Holdens possessed. The approaching men didn't yet know they were here. The horses were hidden behind the barn, and no smoke would be visible from the chimney at this distance. We have surprise on our side, he decided, and we have what they want. He patted his coat where the documents were secured. Clara, do you have weapons here? She nodded, moving to a cabinet and withdrawing a shotgun. Joseph's? I keep it loaded. Good. Van, can you shoot? The boy straightened. Yes, sir. Ma taught me. Samuel handed him the rifle. Only if absolutely necessary. Your job is to protect your mother if things go wrong. He turned to Clara. Is there a cellar beneath the cabin? A crawl space. Yes, access through a trap door in the pantry. It's small, but it'll do. Samuel checked his revolver one last time. If shooting starts, get down there with Van. The evidence is what matters. It has to reach the federal marshals. Clara's expression hardened. We're not leaving you to face them alone. This isn't a debate, Samuel replied, his tone brooking no argument. Rebecca died for these documents. Peterson died. I won't let their sacrifices be in vain, and I won't risk you and Van. The riders were closer now, their approach audible even inside the cabin, the pounding of hooves, the jingle of tack voice, calling instructions to each other. They're spreading out, Samuel observed, moving between windows to track their movements. Two approaching the front, two circling to the back, two toward the barn. Clara positioned herself by the back window, shotgun ready. Van crouched near the pantry door, the rifle across his knees, his young face set in determined lines. Remember, Samuel said quietly, if I fall, take the evidence and go. Through the cellar if possible, or wait until dark and slip away through the trees. The first rider reached the yard, dismounting with a fluid grace that spoke of military training. He approached the cabin cautiously, rifle at the ready. Mrs. Holden, he called. Are you home? It's Deputy Wilson from town. Samuel and Clara exchanged startled glances. Wilson, she whispered. But why so many men? Could be a trick, Samuel warned, though something about the situation felt wrong. Hayes's men wouldn't announce themselves, wouldn't call for Clara by name. Mrs. Holden, Wilson called again. Captain Blackwood, Mayor Abernathy sent us. There's been trouble in town. Samuel made a swift decision. Cover me, he told Clara, then raised his voice. Wilson, identify your companions. Federal marshals, sir, came the immediate reply, and 2 volunteers from town. We've been tracking Hayes's associate Mason since dawn. We have reason to believe he's headed this way. Cautiously, Samuel approached the door, positioning himself to the side before unbarring it. Show yourself clearly, Deputy. The door swung open, revealing Wilson standing in the yard, his badge visible on his coat, his empty hands raised to shoulder height. Behind him, the other riders had maintained a respectful distance, their weapons lowered. Captain Wilson acknowledged relief evident in his expression. Thank God we found you in time. Explain, Samuel demanded, still not lowering his revolver completely. Mason escaped custody last night, Wilson reported. He was Hayes's right hand, and all this knew about the evidence Mrs. Holden might have hidden here. We rode as soon as we discovered he was gone, but he had several hours head start. How did you know we'd be here? Clara asked, joining Samuel at the door, though she kept her shotgun ready. Montgomery told us. He was worried about the captain's wound reopening during the ride and thought we should follow as backup. Wilson's gaze shifted to Samuel's shoulder. Are you all right, sir? Fine, Samuel replied shortly. You're certain Mason is headed here. His trail led east from town, and a station agent at the Peterson Creek crossing reported seeing a rider matching his description about 2 hours ago. He'd be pushing hard to reach the farm before dark. Samuel exchanged a glance with Clara, a silent communication passing between them. They had the evidence now. The most prudent course would be to return to town immediately under the marshal's protection. We'll ride back with you, he decided. We've found what we came for. Wilson nodded clearly, relieved. We should move quickly. Mason is dangerous and likely desperate. Within minutes, they had gathered their belongings and mounted their horses, the federal marshals forming a protective circle around them as they set off toward town. Van rode close to his mother, occasionally glancing back at their homestead until it disappeared from view around a bend in the trail. We'll return soon, Clara promised him softly, once this is finished. Samuel, riding alongside them, found himself hoping her words would prove true, not just for Van's sake, but for all of them. The farm represented something he had almost forgotten, existed the possibility of home, of belonging somewhere again. They had traveled perhaps 3 miles when the first shot rang out, echoing across the snow-covered landscape with startling clarity. One of the marshals pitched forward in his saddle, clutching his arm as his horse reared in panic. "Ambush!" Wilson shouted. "Take cover!" Samuel reacted instantly, grabbing the reins of Clara's horse and pulling both their mounts behind a large boulder as more shots cracked through the winter air. Van had already dismounted, diving into a snowdrift for protection, the rifle still clutched in his hands. The federal marshals returned fire, shooting toward a ridge where muzzle flashes revealed the attackers' positions. Wilson crawled to Samuel's position, his face grim. "Mason and at least 3 others," he reported. "They must have circled ahead of us, knew we'd take this trail back to town." "We need to get Clara and Van out of here," Samuel said, checking his revolver. "The evidence is what they're after." Wilson nodded. "There's a ravine about a quarter-mile back. If you can reach it, follow it west. It leads to the old mining camp. From there, it's a straight shot to town through the pine forest." Samuel quickly relayed the plan to Clara, who had pulled Van to the safety of their position behind the boulder. "Can you make it?" he asked, noting the determination in her face despite the fear evident in her rapid breathing. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "But what about you?" "I'll draw their fire, give you time to reach the ravine." He forestalled her protest with a raised hand. "The documents are what matter, Clara. They need to reach the marshals in town." She recognized the logic, though her expression made it clear she hated leaving him behind. "Be careful," she said simply. "Always am." The ghost of a smile touched Samuel's lips. "Van, take care of your mother." The boy nodded solemnly, clutching the rifle with white-knuckled determination. "Yes, sir." Samuel turned to Wilson. "On my signal, provide covering fire. I'll move to those trees on the left, draw their attention, while Clara and Van head for the ravine." The deputy nodded, relaying the plan to the other marshals through hand signals. The shooting had momentarily subsided, both sides assessing the situation, looking for advantage. Samuel took a deep breath, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounded shoulder. Then, with a quick nod to Clara, he burst from cover, firing rapidly toward the ridge as he ran in a zigzag pattern toward the cluster of pines to his left. The diversion worked. The attackers immediately concentrated their fire on him, bullets kicking up snow at his feet and splintering bark from trees as he dove for cover. Behind him, he caught a glimpse of Clara and Van mounting their horses, then galloping toward the ravine as the marshals provided covering fire. Relief surged through him as they disappeared from view, safely away from the immediate danger. Now he could focus on neutralizing the threat. Mason might be desperate, but Samuel had faced worse odds during the war, and he had far more to fight for now than mere survival. Crouching behind a massive pine, he reloaded his revolver, then carefully assessed the situation. The marshals had spread out, using trees and rocks for cover as they exchanged fire with the ambushers. From his new position, Samuel could see more clearly where the attackers were, 4 men using the ridge's natural rock formations as shelter. One of them, a stocky figure in a dark coat, seemed to be directing the others. Mason, Samuel guessed, recalling the deputy sheriff who had always hovered at Hayes' shoulder during the trial. A plan formed in Samuel's mind. The ridge was steep, but not impassable. If he could circle around through the trees, approach from above, and behind, he might be able to flank the ambushers, force them to divide their attention. Signaling his intention to Wilson, Samuel began moving deeper into the pine forest, using the trees for cover as he worked his way toward the base of the ridge. The going was difficult, snow up to his knees in places, fallen logs and hidden depressions creating treacherous footing. His wounded shoulder protested with each movement, but he pushed the pain aside, focusing on the task at hand. The gunfire continued sporadically, the marshals and ambushers settling into a stalemate, neither side able to gain advantage in their current positions. Good, Samuel thought. It would give Clara and Van more time to reach town and allow him to execute his flanking maneuver. He had nearly reached the base of the ridge when a shadow moved among the trees to his right. Samuel froze, then slowly turned, his revolver raised. Mason stood 20 feet away, his own gun leveled at Samuel's chest. Blood streaked the deputy's face from a cut above his eye, and his breathing was labored, but his aim was steady. "Blackwood," he said, his voice a low growl. "Should have known you'd try something like this." "It's over, Mason," Samuel replied calmly. "Hayes is in custody. The evidence is secure. All you're doing now is adding to your sentence." Mason's laugh was bitter. "You think I care about that? Hayes promised us fortunes when the silver came in. Now it's all gone because of you and that woman. Justice isn't something you can buy off, deputy." "Justice?" Mason spat the word like a curse. "Where was justice when the railroad took my family's land in Kansas, when the banks foreclosed on honest farmers to make way for cattle barons?" His eyes narrowed. Hayes understood how the world really works. Power takes what it wants. The rest of us either join in or get trampled. And that justifies murder, framing innocent people. Samuel kept his voice even, watching for any change in Mason's stance that might telegraph his intentions. "Your badge was supposed to mean something." It meant I got paid, Mason retorted. Same as you once. Don't pretend you're any different, Captain. We've all got blood on our hands. Samuel couldn't deny the truth in that. He had killed during the war, had made compromises as a lawman that still troubled his conscience. But there was a line he had never crossed: the deliberate sacrifice of innocence for personal gain. There's still a choice, Mason, he said quietly. Surrender now. Testify against Hayes and the others. Make something right before the end. For a brief moment, something flickered in the deputy's eyes. Regret, perhaps, or simply weariness. Then his expression hardened again. Too late for that, he said, but I can still make sure Hayes isn't the only one who pays. His finger tightened on the trigger. Samuel reacted instinctively, diving sideways as Mason's gun roared. Pain seared through Samuel's already wounded shoulder as the bullet grazed him, but his own shot flew true, catching Mason in the chest. The deputy staggered backward, surprise replacing the hatred in his eyes. He fired again wildly, the bullet splintering bark from a tree several feet from Samuel. Then his legs gave way, and he collapsed onto the snow blood, spreading in a vivid crimson stain beneath him. Samuel approached cautiously, keeping his revolver trained on the fallen man. But Mason was beyond resistance, now his breathing shallow, and labored, his eyes glazing, as he stared up at the winter sky. Tell Hayes, he gasped, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. I kept my word. Then he was gone, his body slackening as life departed. Samuel stood for a long moment, looking down at the man who had chosen loyalty to a corrupt judge over his oath to uphold the law. In another life, in different circumstances, might Samuel have made similar choices? The question haunted him as he retrieved Mason's weapon and began the difficult climb back down to where Wilson and the marshals waited. The other ambushers had fled once Mason left his position, apparently losing heart without their leader. One had been wounded and captured, the others escaping into the forest. The marshals had suffered only minor injuries, fortunate given the ferocity of the initial attack. Clara and Van, Samuel asked Wilson as they prepared to return to town. Should be well ahead of us by now, the deputy assured him. The ravine route is longer but safer. They'll reach Hope's Landing before nightfall. Samuel nodded, relief washing through him, despite the renewed pain in his shoulder. The evidence was safe. Clara and Van were safe. And Hayes' last desperate attempt to silence the truth had failed. As they rode back toward town, the winter sun beginning its descent toward the western mountains, Samuel found his thoughts turning not to the past but to the future. For the first time in 3 years, he could see a path forward that wasn't defined solely by loss and regret. It was a strange feeling, this cautious hope, unfamiliar after so long in the darkness of grief, but not unwelcome at all. Hope's Landing glowed with lantern light as Samuel and the federal marshals rode down the main street the early winter evening, having already descended into full darkness. News of the ambush had apparently reached town ahead of them. Townspeople emerged from shops and homes to watch their procession, faces solemn in the golden lamplight. Samuel's first concern was for Clara and Van. Relief flooded through him when Dr. Montgomery stepped forward from the gathered crowd, raising a hand in reassurance. They're safe, the doctor called. Arrived an hour ago. Mrs. Holden is at my house with the boy. The tension that had knotted Samuel's shoulders despite his wound finally eased. The evidence was secure, Clara and Van were unharmed, and Hayes' desperate final gambit had failed. Mayor Abernathy appeared beside Montgomery, his expression grave. Captain Blackwood, thank God you've returned safely. We heard there was trouble on the Eastern Trail. Mason, Samuel confirmed, dismounting stiffly. His injured shoulder had begun bleeding again. During the confrontation, the bandage beneath his coat now soaked through. He won't be causing any more problems. Abernathy nodded in understanding. And the documents? Safe with Mrs. Holden, Rebecca's research, and Hayes' own ledger recording payments to his co-conspirators. Enough to convict him 10 times over. The mayor's face lightened with genuine relief. Excellent. The federal prosecutor arrives from Cheyenne tomorrow. He'll want to review everything before Hayes is transported for trial. As they spoke, Dr. Montgomery had moved to Samuel's side, his experienced eye noting the fresh bloodstains on the coat. You've reopened your wound, he observed with professional disapproval. Let's get you to my house immediately. You need attention before you collapse. Samuel started to protest but found he lacked the strength. The long day, the confrontation with Mason, and the blood loss had taken their toll. He allowed Montgomery and one of the marshals to help him toward the doctor's house, acutely aware of the watching townspeople, of the whispers that followed their progress. The tide has turned, Abernathy commented, walking alongside them. Yesterday, half the town still believed Hayes had been wronged. Today, after news of Mason's ambush reached us, few are defending him. People respect direct action more than words, Samuel replied. Mason's attack showed guilt more clearly than any testimony could have. Perhaps, the mayor conceded, or perhaps they simply needed time to recognize the truth that was always before them. At Montgomery's house, Clara was waiting on the porch, despite the cold, her face lighting with relief as she saw Samuel approaching. Van stood beside her, his small figure tense with anticipation. "You're hurt," Clara said, immediately moving to help support Samuel as they climbed the porch steps. "It's nothing," he tried to assure her, but the weakness in his voice betrayed the lie. "Inside, all of you," Montgomery ordered, "before my patient bleeds all over my porch." The next hour passed in a blur for Samuel Montgomery, removing his coat and shirt, cleaning and rebandaging the wound, administering a small dose of laudanum, despite Samuel's protests. Clara assisted throughout her nursing experience, evident in her efficient movements, her steady hands working in perfect coordination with the doctors. Van had been sent to the kitchen to prepare tea, a task that kept him occupied while the adults dealt with Samuel's injury. The boy returned as Montgomery was finishing, carrying a tray with steaming cups and a plate of biscuits that Mrs. Montgomery had apparently prepared earlier. "You were fortunate," the doctor pronounced, washing blood from his hands in a basin. "The bullet only reopened part of the original wound. No new damage to speak of." "Lucky," Samuel agreed, though he felt anything but as waves of pain radiated from his shoulder despite the laudanum's dulling effect. "Reckless would be a more accurate description," Clara chided, helping him into a clean shirt borrowed from Montgomery, facing Mason alone in the forest. "It worked, didn't it?" Samuel's attempt at a smile faltered as another spasm of pain crossed his face. "At what cost?" Clara's voice softened. "Rebecca wouldn't want you to die seeking justice for her, Samuel. Nor would I." The simple statement, delivered without drama or excessive emotion, struck Samuel with unexpected force. "Nor would I." In those three words lay a world of meaning, of possibilities he had thought forever closed to him. Before he could respond, Mayor Abernathy entered the room, accompanied by one of the federal marshals. A tall, imposing man with a carefully trimmed beard and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Captain Blackwood," Abernathy began, "this is Marshal James Harrington from the Denver office. He's overseeing Hayes's case personally." Harrington stepped forward, offering his hand to Samuel. "Captain, your reputation precedes you. Even in Denver, we've heard of the Border Patrol captain who testified against Hayes during the war." Samuel accepted the handshake, noting the strength in the marshal's grip. "That was a lifetime ago, Marshal." "Perhaps, but from what I've seen, your commitment to justice hasn't wavered." Harrington turned to Clara. "Mrs. Holden, I understand you have documents vital to our case against Hayes and Western Consolidated?" Clara nodded, retrieving the oilskin package from where she had secured it in Montgomery's office. "These were compiled by Rebecca Blackwood before her death, with additions from my own investigations. And this," she produced a smaller package containing Hayes's ledger, "is Hayes's personal record of payments related to the land acquisition scheme." Harrington accepted both packages with evident satisfaction. "Excellent. I'll review these tonight and incorporate the evidence into our case." He looked between Clara and Samuel. "Both of you will need to testify, of course, as will young Mr. Holden if he's willing." "I am," Van said firmly from his position near the door. "I want to help." The marshal smiled approvingly. "Good lad. Your testimony about your mother's whereabouts the night Peterson was killed will be particularly valuable." After Harrington and Abernathy departed, promising to return in the morning to take formal statements, an exhausted silence fell over the room. Montgomery excused himself to check on other patients, leaving Samuel, Clara, and Van alone with the weight of the day's events. "You should rest," Clara told Samuel, adjusting the pillows behind him. "The laudanum will make you drowsy soon." "I've had enough rest," he protested, though even as he spoke, he could feel the medicine's effects spreading through him, dulling the pain but also his thoughts. "What about you and Van? You must be exhausted too." "Mrs. Montgomery has prepared a room for us upstairs," Clara replied. "We'll be fine." Van approached the bed, his young face solemn in the lamplight. "I'm glad you're okay, Samuel," he said simply. "I was scared when we had to leave you behind." Samuel found himself touched by the boy's concern. "I've been in worse spots, Van, and I had good men with me." The boy nodded, satisfied with this reassurance. "Ma says we'll be able to go home soon, after Hayes's trial." "That's right," Samuel confirmed. "Back to your farm. Back to normal." But even as he spoke the words, Samuel realized he no longer knew what normal meant. His old life of drifting, of running from grief and memory, held no appeal. Yet returning to his homestead alone, rebuilding from the ashes of the past, seemed equally impossible now. Clara seemed to sense his uncertainty. "Rest now," she said gently. "Tomorrow will bring decisions enough." She shepherded Van from the room with quiet words about washing up before bed. At the door, she paused, looking back at Samuel with an expression he couldn't quite decipher in his laudanum haze state. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Then she was gone, leaving Samuel alone with thoughts that swirled like snow in a winter wind, impossible to grasp or hold steady. Soon the medicine pulled him under into dreams where Rebecca walked beside him in summer fields, her face peaceful as she pointed toward a future he couldn't quite see. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Research Sonnet 3.7.